Silence had overtaken the association head's office. Molly turned to leave, but she was suddenly stopped by a voice. Who was that child, Molly? Replying to association head, I am unsure. He only seemed interested in acquiring a Valor honor card. At first he planned on spending 10 million gold coins before he realized it was impossible and learned that this was his only method. Replying to association head, is that how you speak to your grandfather? If Ryu had been here, he would have nodded in understanding. Why else would someone in such an esteemed position know the name of a mere receptionist? Though, it was odd that a woman with such an esteemed background was relegated to such a role in the first place. But considering the cold attitude she had toward her grandfather, maybe that made more sense than not. You overstepped your bounds today, association head. It was unnecessary to provoke a young genius in such a way, just because your research isn't going the way you'd like it. Those words stung the head into silence. She seemed to be referring to Ryu, but at the same time something completely different. Eventually, the association head snorted. That child was too arrogant. He lowered his head. But it's clear he's not used to hiding his emotions because I could read him like an open book. Why would Ryu be used to such a thing? He was a scion of the Tatsuya clan. He had had the qualifications to wear his heart on his sleeve for the whole of his life. There's no way he'd be comfortable with swallowing his reflexive reactions so soon. It seemed it was something he would have to work on. I hope you don't regret it. Molly's cold response was nothing like the flustered attendant she had been moments ago. Geniuses on his level capable of swallowing their pride and burying their grievances are few and far between. If there comes a day where he stands above your head, it'll be too late. Or maybe it's already too late. Molly left the office without another word. She knew her grandfather wouldn't take her words seriously. He had always been this way. He was probably sneering at the idea of Ryu ever standing above him. Sometimes, older individuals lost proper perspective on things after having had their heads in the clouds for too long. The association head shook his head as Molly expected. The eyes are too important for a herbologist, especially on a test where your sense of smell and touch are taken away from you. His spiritual sense isn't refined enough to pick up the small details the eyes can. Plus, even if he had his eyes, since when was becoming an herbologist so easy? What a joke. Even the inner ring geniuses are at least 50 years old. Soon, the association head had thrown these matters to the back of his mind, burying his head back into his piles of research paper. He forgot all about the young man named Ryu. Ryu had no idea what the association head was thinking, nor would he care if he did. He was more interested in the proceedings of this exam. This looked more like a battleground than an exam room. Ryu debated with himself. His spiritual sense had grown an astronomical amount during his deep sleep. In fact, it had doubled in size from 30 to 60 meters. Unfortunately, true geniuses worked on orders of hundreds of meters after stepping into the spiritual entrance realm. Ryu's understanding of the small realm he was in was limited to just 60 meters. Considering its scale, this was truly too small. But at the same time, this wasn't a projection of his body. It was his true body, meaning if he opened his eyes, there was a chance others could understand that he had heavenly pupils which might cause him trouble later on. Ryu sighed. Is there really nothing in this world that can protect my eyes from detection? Of course there was an answer, his mental realm. By shrouding his pupils in a layer of spiritual sense, he could block all those with weaker mental realms than himself from observing the true abilities of his eyes. With the immortal Sakura as a visualization technique, Ryu's mental realm would have great defensive properties as well, which would only help this. It was just that Ryu had a hard time trusting his own mental realm after he came to understand just how poor his mental cultivation talent was. It's better to be cautious. I'll diligently practice for now. Once I reach my limit, I'll use the gold vein lilies to push myself to the realm of geniuses before entering the spiritual endowment realm and repeating. Oh, that's a new face. A voice coming from Ryu's left caught his attention, likely because Ryu guessed it was referring to himself. It is quite rare for new faces to appear here. They only put us youths in here and send the old fogies elsewhere. If he's here, he must be less than 100 years old. Ryu picked up a few things from this conversation, the least important of which was the fact this was a youth exam. Actually, Ryu was more interested in the fact they were guessing his age. Much like reading someone's cultivation, it was somewhat possible to read another's age as well. Though sharper senses were required, the higher that person's cultivation was considering almost all cultivators looked young. "Hey you," the voice called out to Ryu. "I'm Edward Bastille from the Inner Rings Bastille clan. May I ask who you are?" Ryu's head shifted over toward the voice. "My name is Ryu Tatsuya." Tatsuya. Ryu heard something odd in Edward's voice, but he soon understood. Names held incredible power, especially ones as strong as Tatsuya. If Ryu could boldly proclaim that his name was Tatsuya without being struck down by faith, it meant he was powerful, almost too powerful. No one dared to ask Ryu where he was from. Even if he said he was from the Outer Ring, they would probably never believe him. Ryu smiled. "Great-grandfather, you must still be alive, right? If no one has dared to snatch up the Tatsuya name after so long, you must be. I'll find you too. Then I'll drag you back for daring to leave our clan in its time of need." It was clear by Ryu's smile that he didn't blame his great-grandfather too much. But he didn't have much time to think about it as flickers of energy caught his attention. The exam was beginning. The moment all pillars had an examinee, the atmosphere shifted. One would think they were about to go into battle instead of taking an herbology exam. Soon an image flickered to existence before everyone, each with their own. Ryu soon realized that his spiritual sense could no longer leave the radius of his pillar, nor could he sense other life forms. However, there was also something stopping him from observing the image itself. He could only tell, faintly, that it was of some sort of common grade herb. "I'd like to welcome you all to this round of exams." The bright voice of what sounded like a youthful, yet mature woman entered their ears. "I won't bore you with the details like which round this is, but for those of you who are new, I will explain a few things before you all begin. First, I'll begin with the importance of this exam. A few thousand years ago, the rulers of our realm, the kings, queens, emperors, and empresses of the martial plane, began to prepare us for an impending invasion. According to their information, the blossoming of this generation will be of utmost importance to our success or failure in defending against this threat. It might seem that for a threat of this caliber, battle prowess is most important. However, our leaders have much better foresight than we do. They understand that without the evolution of our professions, our battle prowess will become equally as limited. As a result, they've chosen to invest in certain professions with the help of these exam realms. Your role here is only to use the resources given to you to improve your comprehension of herbology to one day become the pillars that uphold our realm. Do not let failure weigh you down. Learn, improve, adapt. We're all rooting for you. Good luck. The moment the energetic woman's voice faded, the veil around the image that floated before Ryu disappeared. However, while others dove into their exam as a timer began to tick away, Ryu paused, a deep frown setting into his handsome features. Unfortunately, he simply didn't have enough information to address his worries. This so-called invasion was likely the same event brought up by the Zhu clan ancestors. But how could Ryu trust that a group of individuals power-hungry enough to eradicate his home shrine plane, the martial plane, had now turned over a new leaf to begin looking after the youths of their generation? Ryu sneered. "If you'd like to help me so badly, who am I to turn my nose up at your offer?" Ryu's mind sharpened as he focused on the floating image before him. Some of the faster individuals had already moved on to their second or third image, while the slower were just completing their first. The concept of this first round was simple. An image of a common grade herb was presented. However, this image was purposely flawed. It was a spliced-together image of numerous herbs. The examinees were tasked with pointing out the flaws and naming the common grade herb. The issue here was that it was a spliced herb. This meant that what was a flaw and what was not was dependent on numerous factors. An examinee had to first analyze the image and decide what herb made up the largest percentage of the image, then name everything else as a flaw. This was several orders of magnitude more difficult than simply naming an herb. Just to clear one image, one had to understand several herbs not as a whole, but down to its individual parts. This image is spliced with two different herbs, 90% of which is spice primer root and 10% of which bear bane root. Both were root-type spiritual herbs. Spice primer root was known for its ability to enhance cooking by making spices and herbs taste more aged. It was especially good for use in low-quality spiritual wines and beers, due to its ability to cut down the time needed for the aging process as well. Bear bane root was good for shooing away mammalian-type beasts, especially ones with a hibernation cycle. It was able to accelerate the chemical reactions that signaled to beasts it was time to hibernate, making them more languid and slowing their reaction times. Ryu recognized them immediately. Though he wasn't using his heavenly pupils, his mind was on another level after fusing with the embryonic origin flame. His memory was already excellent, but it became even more so after this event. He could recall memories even from when he was a child with absolute clarity. Like this, Ryu unknowingly fell into a breath of earth state. Before, he could only hold on for half an hour, but now that his mental realm had doubled in size, holding on for 2 or even 3 hours was no problem. He tore through the exam with a practiced ease. He went so quickly that his hands blurred as he quickly picked out flaws and named herbs. Even the shifting images couldn't keep up with his speed. At some point in time, those on pillars near Ryu couldn't help but look over. Though spiritual sense was blocked, their eyes worked just fine. The most irritating part was that they couldn't even accuse Ryu of randomly answering questions to look cool. The purpose of the pillars below their feet was to move along with the examinee's completion percentage. If one got a question wrong, they would move back. If they got one right or partly right, they would move forward a certain amount. But Ryu hadn't moved backward even once. The questions continued to become more difficult. At first, there were only 2 herbs spliced together with exaggeratedly different percentage makeups. However, soon the 9:1 ratios Ryu began with became 8:2, then 7:3. Eventually, herbs began to show up as 55% and 45%. The percentages became so close that deciding which herb was the principal herb and which parts were flawed became as difficult as scaling a mountain even if you recognized both herbs immediately. However, it didn't stop there. After reaching that threshold, 2 herbs became 3, then 4. Eventually, even 10 herbs were being spliced together at varying percentages. Ryu didn't even realize it, but he had already gone past the threshold needed for the first round of this exam. One was only supposed to move forward 33 meters to pass the first round, but Ryu was already past the 100-meter mark that was required to pass the whole exam. Somewhere, maybe on a different plane, the energetic woman watched all of this happen. She was tired of spitting up her drink, so she placed her glass of spiritual wine a long ways from herself. Of course, she knew that she could also complete this exam with such flying colors, but she was, without exaggeration, hundreds of times older than Ryu, and had long since become a heaven-grade herbologist. Even with her level of genius, she had never been able to do this at Ryu's age. To be fair, Ryu was actually over 1,000 years old mentally, so it wasn't an exact comparison. But even if the lady knew this, she would still be embarrassed because she was over 10,000 years old. Oh boy, how do I deal with this one? Ryu's hand reached forward with striking speed, seemingly acting before his mind could even finish a complete thought. However, it was then that the exam completely changed, forcing him to pause. Hoo! Ryu snapped out of his breath of earth, his mind shaking awake to find that the round of questions he had become so used to was different now. Is this the second round? Before, the images would be spliced herbs, but now what appeared before Ryu was a miniature environment. It seemed to be a small illusory garden, scaled down to the width size of about 3 or 4 palm lengths. This particular garden seemed to be one built upon a lake. Spiritual herbs that could grow in this kind of environment were in the minority, but Ryu knew that they definitely existed. This was the norm for water attribute herbs. As Ryu was analyzing the environment before him, the herbs he was looking for appeared hovering above the water garden. It was then that Ryu understood the purpose of this second round. Being a herbologist wasn't just about recognizing herbs. A large part of their job was to act as gardeners. In Ryu's first life, he revitalized many extinct species of herbs with this ability. He was a large part of the reason his parents grew so powerful despite them being relatively young in comparison to other powerhouses. It was a part of the profession Ryu was incredibly familiar with. The goal of this second round was to do exactly that. An environment was spawned, and the examinee's job was to adjust said environment within certain bounds to foster the growth of the herbs they've been provided with. Of course, this was all a simulation. After one had adjusted their environment to their liking and planted their herbs, a time lapse would occur where a third-party system would decide based on accumulated data just how viable the examinee's choices were. They didn't make this easy, Ryu thought with a light smile. They've given me a water environment, but the herbs I must grow would die if planted directly into the water this way. Ryu had 3 herbs this time, only one of which would be able to grow under these conditions. But even then, it wouldn't be perfect because this was a freshwater environment, while the herb in question was best suited to a saltwater environment. Herbs that could survive in salt water were incredibly rare. Salt was incredibly good at drying organisms out, so an herb capable of living in such a biosphere was very special. That's the key, Ryu's eyes flashed. Fostering the growth of herbs isn't just about adjusting the environment, but also about controlling what herbs came before it and come after it. The concept of crop rotation was an incredibly important one. Depending on what herbs were once grown in an area, it could either hinder or foster the growth of spiritual herbs that come afterward. When Ryu noticed that one of his given herbs was a saltwater herb, he immediately understood the crux of the exam. Ryu was given 3 herbs: drying leaf, flame lotus, and lightning blossom. To any sane herbologist, growing all 3 herbs in the same area was stupidity of the highest degree. For one, flame lotuses were completely incompatible with an all-water environment. Secondly, lightning and water don't mix. In the case that the lightning blossom could grow, it would spark the deaths of all other herbs around it. In the case that the lightning blossom couldn't grow, that would just be another failure. Thirdly, drying leaf was a saltwater herb, but this was a freshwater lake. However, after just 3 seconds, Ryu's hand had already begun to move. It can't be. The energetic exam overseer sat up. Even she was still thinking of the perfect solution. This exam was far more difficult than the normal herbologist exams, because it was created with the specific purpose of finding talents. This difficulty only increased in the second round. Even a heaven-grade herbologist like herself needed some time to think of a solution. This was precisely why there was no time limit after the first round. Genius. The overseer stood up abruptly. Drying leaf has to be in saltwater environments because its osmosis potential is too strong. It looks like a small leaf with an equally small body, but its roots and stem have countless perforations that push its surface area to a ridiculous level. On top of that, it has an innate chi circulation system that accelerates the absorption of water. The only way to stop this herb from drying up beds of lakes and rivers everywhere is to counter with salt water, which can mitigate its ability to some extent. If this isn't done, not only will the herb become useless, but so would the environment it was planted in. This child, he planted the lightning blossom and drying leaf herbs together. By arranging them in a perfectly balanced formation, he's using the natural lightning element circulation of the lightning blossom to supercharge chemicals and force them to break apart. He can't create salt in this way, since he doesn't have the appropriate building blocks, but he can decrease the concentration of molecules drying leaf has a high affinity for in the surrounding water, which would slow down osmosis. This forces the drying leaf to slow its absorption of water, while at the same time preventing the water from interfering with the lightning blossom too much. On one hand, the drying leaf is taking most of the water for itself, while on the other, the lightning blossom is even further lessening the effect of the water. Using this cycle, the water in the lake drains, but not quickly enough for the drying leaf to become unviable. Then, once the lake bed dries out completely, it becomes the perfect environment for the flaming lotus. This isn't just herbology, it's practically terraforming. The most important part here is the formation of lightning blossoms and drying leaves. If there were too many of either herb in a certain area, the balance would have been shattered. Either the drying leaf would absorb too much water too quickly, or the lightning would be overwhelming and destroy all other herbs. If the latter occurred, then only the lightning blossoms would survive while the flame lotus wouldn't even be able to be planted. 3 seconds. 3 seconds. The usually energetic overseer felt deflated. It only got worse when Ryu once more sank into breath of earth, causing his speed to reach a new level. It didn't matter what the environment was or what herbs he was given. Desert, mountain peaks, underwater caves, clouds, rocks, it didn't matter. Before Ryu even realized it, he couldn't even see any fellow exam takers around him anymore. It was as though something toward the center was calling him, as though it was luring him. As much as he wanted to know what it was even more that true that whatever it was ecstatic. It had waited too long. Someone worthy had finally come. Just who is this child? The energetic overseer trained her pretty, sparkling eyes on Ryu. She was too intrigued. It's impossible for a Kai refinement expert to carry such an air of purity. The only explanation is that he has a high-grade constitution, at least heaven grade, maybe mystical grade. Cultivation was all about refining the human body to higher levels of perfection. Though the appearance of an individual might seem superficial, it was actually quite tied to one's talent. The more beautiful a person was in comparison to others of their cultivation, the greater talent they tended to have. The overseer could clearly see the effects of Ryu's ice jade crystal body, though it was also possible for an individual to be attractive and a weak talent. The overseer had a hard time accepting this possibility as she watched Ryu tear through the second round. At this point, within the eerie examination small realm, Ryu was wondering if he should tone back a bit, but in the end he shook his head. The feeling of lowering his head to a mere association head just hours ago was still gnawing at his heart. He hated that feeling. He didn't want to feel it again so soon. Still, just what is this small realm? What is calling me? Ryu could feel his heavenly pupils throbbing. It wasn't the same painful throbbing that warned him of danger. This was a throbbing he hadn't felt in decades. The very throbbing that told him that he was close to a treasure. Ryu could vaguely feel that this trigger of sorts was far more powerful than it was in his last life. This was likely because his cultivation was much greater, so the freedom his pupils had followed in kind. However, he wondered what would happen if he suddenly monopolized a treasure in this place. It was obvious to Ryu now that they were sent here because of this treasure, and it definitely wasn't to uplift the youths of this generation either. Ryu was very familiar with ruins, so he knew that many of them came in 3 forms. The first form was without restriction, the second was a cultivation restriction, and the final was an age restriction. In all likelihood, this small realm was one with an age restriction. Probably 100 years, just like that Bastille clan fellow said. The issue was that becoming an herbologist with the appropriate level of skill in just 100 years was nigh impossible. Though crazy as it may seem, even Ryu wasn't certain if he could perform this well back when he was that young. What legacy realm could have standards so high? In Ryu's defense, the reason he doubted his younger self in this fashion was precisely because he didn't have cultivation. As a result, his pupils were far weaker than they should have been, and his memory wasn't as crystal clear either. One's mental capacity greatly increases along with cultivation, so it was obvious that Ryu was handicapped in this fashion back then. If he had had cultivation, Ryu was confident that his younger self would have breezed through this exam just as easily. This is the third round, huh? Ryu paused as the questions changed once more. Oh, interesting. The third round was a major change once more. This time, two separate categories of spiritual herbs spawned. One category was a spliced herb, similar to what one could have seen in the first round. The second category was a group of numerous herbs. It seemed the goal of this third round was to cure a poison. In this sense, poison is a rather loose term. It isn't that the first category spliced herb was created to be a poison, but rather that its spliced together portions had an unintended adverse reaction within the body of anyone who took it. The examinees would then have to use the group of spawned herbs in order for the first spliced herb to function as intended. This was yet another layer of difficulty. The first round was mostly about herb recognition. The second was about herb growth. And this third round was about herb functions and interactions. One didn't just need to understand the functions of herbs, but also how they reacted in the presence of each other. Ryu smiled lightly. This time he didn't slip into breath of earth, not because he couldn't, but because he wanted to be more mindful of his surroundings. Something was telling him that a large change was about to occur. What's this? Ryu looked down at his chest. Something he hadn't noticed before had appeared there. It was then that a sudden realization overcame him. Oh, it was a badge. It had a plain wooden appearance formed into a U-shaped shield, and 4 star-shaped holes gracing its front. 2 of the center stars were about 1-fold larger than the 2 smaller stars to their sides. As of now, all 4 stars were filled with a gentle golden light. While Ryu was in his breath of earth state, it seemed he hadn't realized that he had already passed the requirements for the lower common grade. In fact, the glowing of all 4 stars meant he was on the verge of earning the black grade already. As though to confirm his guess, the moment Ryu completed the first question of the third round, the badge changed once more. It morphed from a sturdy, oak-like wood to a piece of impenetrable black steel. It retained the same shape, but the golden color that filled the stars was gone. It seemed as though they had been absorbed in order to change the form of the badge. It seems my goal has been completed. Ryu struggled slightly. The best herbologist in Varler City was a mere higher black-grade herbologist, meaning she had only filled 3 stars of this black badge. If Ryu surpassed that, he didn't know what kind of trouble it might bring. If this was a normal exam, Ryu would have begun to purposely make mistakes now until he was kicked out. However, that voice calling him, the one moving his pillar forward now, he had a feeling that he shouldn't ignore not. No, he couldn't ignore it. Ryu continued to blaze through. Since he had decided he would go all out, his badge continued to grow. As his hands blurred, 1 star was filled, then a second and a third. By the time the 4th was being completed, Ryu was already nearly finished with the 4th round of questions. A 4th round. The overseer was in shock. As far as she knew, there were only 3 rounds, and this 4th round, wasn't it too much to ask a youth to complete it? Is this what they were looking for all this time? Is this what they were hoping would happen? Do I protect this boy? The energetic overseer wasn't a fool. Though she spoke of the martial plane glowingly, she knew the reality of the matters. These kids were being used, not mentored. However, who would have known that just as she was struggling with her decision, everything would go black? Not only had all of the youths been forcibly teleported back, Ryu was nowhere to be seen. While the herbology exam was thrown into chaos, Ryu was completely oblivious. Since he was unaware of how things normally worked, he assumed that this was what normally occurred. Still, even he felt it was a bit odd when he was suddenly teleported once more. It wasn't the teleportation itself that confused him. It was rather the fact that his spiritual sense ceased to function altogether. The energy fluctuations around him were so fierce that he couldn't even push his spiritual sense even a single centimeter from his body. However, what he heard was even more odd. There was the faint sound of rushing water and rustling leaves, but it was the giggling and laughter that truly caught Ryu off guard. It sounded like little girls were running around having fun. He could almost feel the adorable atmosphere even with his eyes closed. In the end, Ryu opened his eyes. He had no choice. What did the secrets of his heavenly pupils mean if he died here trying to hide it? If his spiritual sense was useless, it would be too easy for him to fall into danger. Even if this place sounded safe and cheery, Ryu knew better than to simply trust that instinct. Fairies. Ryu's pupils constricted as he took in the environment around him. It was exactly as he imagined. No, it was even more beautiful than he imagined. Lush trees, rushing and intertwining rivers, green grass, and a heavenly, intoxicating fragrance that filled one with a rush of calm. Small women, at most 6 inches tall, and some as small as 3 inches floated around, tugging on Ryu's black robes as though begging him to come and play. Ryu was shocked. Even with his wealth of experience, this wasn't something he could have ever predicted he would see in his lifetime. Fairies were from the spirit race, and as such didn't normally appear in this realm. Logically speaking, it didn't make sense that they were here. Ryu did know a small bit about the spirit race. After all, his death guard Nuri was half a member of this race. This was the reason why her beauty was so intoxicating, and was also why she could hide in the void for such extended periods of time. Nuri. Ryu felt a slight swelling of emotion he immediately tempered down. As a child, he remembered promising Nuri that he would one day grow big enough to protect her. She was his big sister, one he loved dearly, but he pathetically ended up being the one protected by her all his life. If you're alive, I won't fail this time, Nuri. He smells really good for a human. You're right, he smells like nature. Usually humans are really smelly. Ryu took a step forward, heading toward the voice that seemed to be calling out to him. He directly ignored the fluttering fairies. It didn't take long, maybe because this space was so small, for him to reach a clear center. What he found was yet another surprise. It was a coffin, carved with beautiful crystalline gems, but the lid was cracked open, causing the beautiful coffin to be completely overshadowed by the gorgeous beauty that now sat atop of it. Her eyes sparkled like red rubies, observing Ryu with a teasing expression. However, her hair was like a cascading waterfall of gold, falling far longer than the length of her body. Still, even if one wanted to pay attention to such things, the fact that she was naked made it nigh impossible for even a woman, let alone a man, to do so. Skin as blemishless and pure as the year's first snowfall, curves as perfectly proportioned as the most golden of ratios, and a seductive air only possibly refined after countless years. Her legs were long, crossed over as to hide her most treasured of places, but her chest was in full view, delicate slopes of flesh, as soft as the clouds in the blue sky. Her breasts almost seemed too large to fit on her body. Ryu could tell that this woman was also a fairy by her aura, but her size was far more pronounced than the others. In fact, she stood at an exceptionally tall height for a woman. Had Ryu not grown in large, thanks to his fire dragon blood, he would definitely be shorter than her, who stood at almost 6'2". "Are you the one who called me here?" Ryu asked. The fairy who sat atop the coffin pouted adorably. Seeing such a beauty make such an expression, Ryu would be lying if he said he wasn't shaken. Of all the beauties he had seen in his life, only Eska could match this woman before him. However, he wasn't the kind of man to allow himself to be swayed so easily. "You really don't know how to please a woman," the fairy said playfully. Her voice almost made one want to fall asleep. It was too soothing. "But I guess that's only to be expected. It seems your soul is tied to another. Your wife must be a very lucky woman." Ryu's eyes narrowed. He didn't flinch when the Zoo ancestors saw through all his secrets, but he did now. There was a very simple reason for this. When Ryu sends his mind into the crystalline jade, he's inherently exposing himself. It's almost like opening up your everything. This was why the Zoo ancestors understood his talents and fought so easily. But this situation was different. He was in the real world now. It shouldn't be possible to see through him so easily. There's no need to be so anxious. The reason I can see through you so easily is because our wavelengths match. You were born to be with me as I was born to be with you. Wavelengths, the fairy nodded. Just like I can see all of you, you can see all of me if you just concentrate a little bit. Right. Ryu immediately realized that she was correct. Ale saw. The fairy began to clap happily, causing her fleshly mounds to bounce. That's my name. Ryu was inwardly shocked. He really could see through Ailsa completely. Even seeing her current thoughts wasn't impossible. Us fairies are destined to be tied to another from our birth. Some of us are born to protect a particular spiritual herb. Others are tied to high-order beasts, but it's very rare for a human to share a wavelength with a fairy. Humans are quite an elite race, relatively speaking, but your people are too invested in controlling nature to connect with it. So it's very rare for us to even come to this realm ruled by you all. Ryu sighed. Why was it that this kind of woman always seemed to attach themselves to him? He was a cold, stoic man, so why were his wife and now his destined fairy such polar opposites of him? Ailsa giggled. You forget that you were once like this too. Hardship changed you too much. Ryu didn't refute. I only want to know one thing. Will you make me stronger? Ailsa seemed amused by Ryu's question. She stood from her coffin, revealing a small triangular patch of golden hair between her legs as she almost glided toward Ryu. In what seemed to take an eternity, she made her way before him, looking up and into his silver eyes with her own sparkling rubies. Her smile shone like the stars in the sky, her soft pink lips curling into a gentle slope. If I couldn't see into your mind, I would think that I was an ugly woman. It's a good thing for me that I can. I have a wife. Ryu replied plainly. Ailsa giggled lightly. Am I not more attractive by your human standards? Ryu's eyes frosted over. If you dare to speak ill of my wife again, I won't care for what benefits you can bring me. I'll kill you where you stand. Ailsa sighed. How unfair. She was unmoved by Ryu's threat, though she could tell that it was very much real. I've waited more years than I care to count for you, yet you refuse to fully accept me. Ryu frowned. What are you talking about? You still don't understand. Ailsa looked into Ryu's eyes. Looking at how serious she was, Ryu caught a glimpse of why his wavelength matched with his woman. That gaze. To think she could look like this too. Us fairies don't have this thing you humans call sexuality. We choose our life partners based on our wavelengths and compatibility. Even if you were the small sprout of a nameless tree, I would stay by your side for the rest of my life. Ryu wanted to refute this as ridiculous. Wasn't this the same thing as allowing fate to decide your own happiness? Ryu had decided to never allow fate to rule his life again. So how could he sit here and listen to this woman speak about how they were meant for each other? However, Ailsa interrupted him. Don't push the concepts of you humans onto us fairies. Our cultures are too different. You've gotten to where you are today by supposedly fighting fate. But have you really? Do you know how many individuals have been born with ancestral great circles throughout all of time? Not just this realm, but every realm in existence. The answer is less than 10,000. Ailsa shifted her gaze from Ryu. And do you know how many individuals were lucky enough to also be chosen by a sky god as well? The answer is one, and that one person is you. I haven't even spoken about your heavenly pupils, or your birth into the Tatsuya clan. Do you really have the face to go to an orphan without cultivation talent, born on the lowest mortal plane, and tell him or her to keep their head up and fight fate? My dearest life partner, your perspective of the world is shallow, filled with arrogance and overblown pride, and truly laughable. Ryu silently listened to Ailsa's piercing words. Wasn't she correct? When had he ever truly fought against fate? He kept lamenting a hard life that truly didn't seem hard at all. To answer your question, yes, I will make you stronger, but not as strong as I could if you accepted me, something you clearly have no intention of doing. I am among the highest races of fairies. We are known as the cultist sprites. We stand above elementals and battle fairies, despite not having much combat prowess of our own. We are known for our ability to nurture and foster growth. Cultist has many meanings in many different ancient languages, but it is centered around a general meaning of to nurture. The legends of gods and goddesses in your human lore that focus such things are usually tied to my ancestors. I have the ability to increase the growth speed of spiritual herbs. Right now, I can do so by several 10,000 times. But in order to leave this space, I will need to bind my soul with yours, as I cannot exist outside the fairy realm without my life partner. Unfortunately, This process will limit me in two ways. The first is by level of intimacy between us life partners, and the second is by your cultivation. By my estimates, it'll be limited to a 10 times increase due to being limited in both. Next, I have the ability to unlock the potential of beasts. My people have turned many a snake into arrogant dragons. If you find suitable beast companions, I will be able to untether them from the chains of their weak bloodlines and limiters. I also have the ability to sense strong centers of nature, similar to life partners' feng shui comprehension, but on a much deeper level. Given time, I can find life partner many great and hidden areas of cultivation. My presence soothes the heavens. Simply by binding yourself to me, your cultivation speed will increase, as will your ability to comprehend. There will also be many excellent passive effects, such as increased healing capacity and energy recovery. But most important will be the impact on sensing natural orders, specifically natural enlightenments and elements. My impact on comprehending birthed phenomena is limited since they were constructed by you humans. But in terms of natural endowments and elements, I will be of great help. With me, I guarantee you that you'll only need a few days to touch upon the entry boundary of your northern heavenly wind. Finally, and maybe most important to you, I can shroud and protect life partner. Fairies are very good at existing between a state of reality and imaginary. I can make it so that no one will be capable of sensing your ancestral great circle or your heavenly pupils. At least, no one on the pedestal plane will be able to. What xianxia didn't bother to say was that if her and Ryu's intimacy was at the highest level, even the new rulers of the martial plane wouldn't be able to see through him, unless they reached the soul quintessence realm. However, there wasn't really much of a point in saying this, right? Ryu continued to silently gaze at xianxia. He knew well what she was thinking, as she knew well what he was thinking. He wanted to use her for the sake of saving his family, but there was nothing further. This sort of reality deeply scarred xianxia, causing her to put her playful attitude away. How many years had she been dreaming of her life partner, only to run into this unfeeling man? At the same time, Ryu himself also got a rude awakening. xianxia had shrouded her previously jarring and piercing words by beginning to list her uses to Ryu, as though she was a tool rather than a person, but they still hung in the air as though they had never left. "Let's go," Ryu finally said. If this soul link was witnessed by others, they'd feel a shiver of coldness. One would never guess that xianxia and Ryu had just bound their souls to one another. xianxia simply shrank to the size of a palm and shrouded herself in a white gown to sit on Ryu's shoulder silently as he left the hidden realm. The silent association head office was filled with a gentle flashing light as Ryu reappeared once more. The association head sensed this and snorted. "It hasn't even been a few hours yet, but you already failed. Isn't that too pathetic? What a waste of Kai stones. I'm sure you can see your way out, correct?" He didn't even bother to look up from his papers. Ryu's head turned toward the older man, whose head was buried in a stack of papers. "Esteemed association head, with your lofty position, you're likely the only one in the Alchemy Association capable of awarding valor honor cards, correct? Listen, you annoying brat, get the hell out of my office. I don't care for your worthless flattery. I'm not intentionally trying to disturb you. I only meant to say that since I'm here already, I thought I should ask you to handle the procedures." The association head finally looked upward, a vein of anger pulsing through his wrinkled forehead. But what he found were piercing silver eyes that lacked even more patience. They were a pair of silver eyes that filled him with a cold and irrational fear. It was then that the association head noticed, right there on the left side of Ryu's chest, a badge forged of black steel. However, it wasn't just any badge. Etched across the top of its shield-like structure was a vine of holding small leaves and delicate flower drawings. It was the badge of an herbologist, F4 stars. The association head blinked, not believing his eyes. "Who are you? Esteemed association head, can you fulfill my request, or must I ask someone else?" The monotone inflections of Ryu's voice didn't change. It was as though he hadn't heard the association head's questions at all. Oh, of course, the association head calmed himself. Just under 3 hours had passed since Ryu had disappeared, but the herbology exam was known for taking several days to complete. This wasn't under normal circumstances, of course. It was just that the youth exam was particularly special. However, not only had Ryu reappeared in less than 3 hours, he came back with the credentials of a peak black-grade herbologist. The association head would be a fool if he didn't understand he had made a mistake. The process of receiving his Valor Honor Card went quickly. Ryu didn't say another word to the association head, nor did he need to. Identity treasures like an herbologist badge or the Valor Honor Card were tied to an individual's Kai signature. Unless one had a rare technique capable of perfect replication of another person, it was impossible to fake. Of course, nothing was infallible, but for now, Ryu was fine. Ryu made his way back to Molly, so he didn't have to waste time listening to her console him about his apparent failure. He directly placed his Valor Honor Card on the reception desk before she could utter a word. However, it seemed he underestimated just the level of value this card had. The whole of the Alchemy Association seemed to come to a grinding halt as dozens of pairs of eyes trained on a singular piece of metal cutout shimmering with violet colors and holographic weapons. Soon, those eyes shifted from the card to its owner. Ryu's presence was completely different with his eyes opened. Even with Ailsa's shroud, he still appeared untouchable to many. Ryu's face had already been etched into the minds of many. Molly, a mere receptionist, was surprisingly the first to recover, as she slowly handed Ryu a memory jade filled with their association's inventory. She sighed inwardly. It seemed her intuition was correct. She could only imagine her grandfather's feelings after he was forced to hand this card to Ryu. Why did he have his eyes closed previously? And why did he decide to open them now? Though she thought this, Molly had her own guesses. Much like her grandfather, she knew the importance the eyes had for herbologists. Low-ranking spiritual senses weren't good enough to pick up on all the small details an herbologist's eyes had to. So, Molly thought that maybe Ryu was forced to rely on his eyes during the exam, and gave up whatever spiritual sense training he was doing before that. The selection here isn't amazing, but it will do. Ryu ignored the eyes floating around him, focusing entirely on the inventory list that appeared in his mind. Not only did he need cultivation herbs for Kai, the body and the mind, he also needed something he could use to ensure that he had no more hidden injuries. I will take 50 stalks each of Kai cleansing leaf, blood boiling stem, and mind calming leaf. In addition, I'll take 100 dosages each of revitalizing petal and vital tree essence, plus a log of seeking wood. Molly's lip twitched, but she still went ahead with her duties. Kai cleansing leaf helped prep and prime one's Kai for their next revolution. It was excellent for accelerating Kai accumulation and greatly shortened the time between revolutions. Blood boiling stem was an auxiliary herb meant to be used along with beast blood and spiritual roots. It was placed into the collected blood and acted as a catalyst that made absorbing the latent vital Kai far easier. It made for smoother body cultivation. Mind calming leaf allowed one to focus on visualization for longer periods of time, and thus aided mental realm cultivation. There were two important aspects to mental realm cultivation. One was, of course, accumulating spiritual Kai. This directly influenced everything from how powerful and far-reaching one's spiritual sense was, to how long one could sustain meditation states or one's natural orders. However, the second aspect was just as important and touched upon the same factors. It was known as Focus Kai. Focus Kai was exactly what it sounded like. It referred to a martial warrior's capacity for focus, how long they could spend meditating, how long they could spend in seclusion, or even how long they could maintain the sharpness of their attacks in battle. Though it was called Focus Kai, there was no empirical way to measure one's focus. It could only be improved with time and meditation. Mind calming leaf essentially artificially increased focus for a small period of time. All of revitalizing petal, vital tree essence, and seeking wood were related to Ryu's body recovery. Cultivation was important, but recovery was equally if not more important. Revitalizing petal resembled rose petals and were meant to be diluted in large baths of hot water. Seeking wood was what Ryu planned on building these baths with, as they were able to seek and pull away impurities naturally. Finally, vital tree essence would be the hot water Ryu used in this equation. It referred to the deep root water taken from the vital tree, a spiritual tree known for little else but its ridiculously long lifespan. It was said a mortal could gain 100 years of life, drinking its vital essence. However, all of these things obviously came with an extremely exaggerated price. Molly coughed slightly. That'll be 3,600,000 gold. Ryu didn't blink at the obscene price that represented the near sum earnings of Valor City in a year. He simply went about the business of handing what he owed over. He didn't plan on making this sort of large purchase again, anyway. After all, he had the incubator. The only reason he bought so much to begin with was so that he'd have a sustained flow until the incubator could provide him a continuous stream of resources. The incubator, after being improved by the origin essence of Ryu's final right, could accelerate growth by 1,000 times. If this was stacked with Ailsa's abilities, it was the equivalent of a 10,000 times increase in speed. This meant that Ryu's spirit-seeking lilies would only take 1 year to reach maturity instead of his previous 10-year estimate. However, the black-grade herbs Ryu had just bought wouldn't take nearly as long. Mental realm herbs worked on a bit of a different system, but in terms of Kai and body herbs, the incubation times went up by increments of 10 times. Common-grade herbs needed about a year to at most 10 years to reach maturity, while black-grade herbs needed 10 to 100 years, and earth-grade herbs required anywhere from 100 to 1,000, and so on. By this logic, Ailsa wouldn't need to do much of anything. It would only take a month for the incubator to create an entire farm of black-grade herbs. With Ailsa's help, it would only take 3 days. Normally, an herb on the level of the spirit-seeking lilies would take several 100,000, if not millions of years to reach maturity. That said, because the spirit-seeking lilies split their maturation into 2 stages, the preparation stage and the spiritual Kai absorption stage, it was able to have a flexible growth period, dependent on the concentration of spiritual Kai around it. Since Ryu had an entire lake of spiritual Kai, it made the second phase negligible, and thus shortened the time frame needed. All mental realm type herbs functioned in this way, including the mind-calming leaf. So, for Ryu's purposes, they'd only take a day to be prepared as opposed to the 3 days of the other herbs. Ryu left the association, ignoring the eyes that followed him out. His next destination was the Valor auction house, where he would buy himself some appropriate ores. "Ah, young Master Ryu, your order was a bit stringent, but I think we did it justice." A youth covered by a layer of soot grinned when Ryu stepped into the small blacksmith. The young man scurried behind a loose, raggedy curtain only to lug back 3 large rectangular boxes of solid black. The strength of the youth was clear here. Ryu estimated that the total weight of these 3 boxes was almost 10,000 jin. Ryu wouldn't be able to lift such a heavy weight unless he circulated his Kai, but this young man did it with nothing but his body. "These should be some of my father's proudest works." The young man's smile almost shone a light of its own. "Thank you for giving him the opportunity to work with such high-quality materials. My father is resting right now, but he wanted me to give you these for free." Ryu went to refute, but the young man stopped him. "My father broke into the earth grade because of you. Trust me, the value of such a thing to him far surpasses a few gold coins. Thank you." Though Ryu felt conflicted, it seemed like the young man wouldn't take no for answer. Just 3 days prior, after Ryu finished his business with the Valor auction house, he began his search for a blacksmith. In the end, he settled on this small shop because Ailsa pointed it out to him. Since he and Ailsa formed their cold link with one another, she hadn't spoken to him. She only completed the tasks she knew he wanted her to complete by reading his mind and intentions. In fact, she hadn't even spoken when she pointed toward the blacksmith. She only sat silently on his shoulder and lifted her arm. In the end, Ryu simply decided to follow her suggestion. The owner of the blacksmith was from a small branch family of the Ember clan. This young man's father wasn't incredibly skilled by any stretch of the imagination, but Ryu understood why Ailsa pointed him out quickly. His grade wasn't high, but he resonated with the true nature of the materials to an incredible degree, bringing out their full potential. But this wasn't due to his own skill, but rather the special xianxia of the Ember clan. According to what Ryu could gather from the thoughts, Ailsa didn't speak. The Ember clan used a special branch of sealing cultivation, known simply as restrictions. The fiercer the restriction, the stronger their xianxia. This young man's father, Blacksmith Ember, restricted himself from ever using his xianxia outside of these walls. As if that wasn't enough, he also swore to only use it for forging weapons. And as if even that wasn't enough, he swore to only make weapons for those whom the ores accepted. The trouble was that this man was incredibly untalented in the field of blacksmithing. Even with his xianxia specifically tailor-made for it, he was mediocre at best. Luckily for Ryu, his Ember clan's special xianxia, known as Ember Kai, overcompensated for his lack of skill to a great extent. After interacting with the family, Ryu only had 2 words for them: too stubborn. Ryu was shocked to find out that Blacksmith Ember was actually a divine vessel realm expert, only a step away from the connecting heaven realm. At the same time, his son, Vaya, was older than Ryu but was a mere pulse opening realm expert. The sad part, Vaya's blacksmithing talent was one Ailsa felt could become otherworldly with proper mentoring. This was her vision as a cultist fairy. Likewise, Blacksmith Ember was a cultivation talent the likes of which rarely appeared in the world. Yet the father wanted to be a blacksmith, while the son wanted to be a cultivator. Ryu almost felt that the visit to this blacksmith shop had little to do with the Ember clan's Ember Kai, and everything to do with Ailsa making a silent but fierce point. Sometimes, no matter how much you will it, you won't be able to accomplish what you set out to do. This so-called fighting fate that Ryu was so proud of himself for doing was really just him, working within the confines of a lane fate allowed him. He was just luckier than others. Maybe this was why he hadn't dared to read his fate star, even after his spiritual foundation awoke. When Ryu took the 3 black boxes into his arms, he felt that their weight suddenly carried something outside of normal heaviness. The level of resolve this Ember clan father and son pair had, did he have it? If my cultivation never awoke, would I still have had the perseverance to seek out revenge for Granny Miriam? Would I still dare to work towards saving my family? Would I dare to search for my wife? Ailsa sat silently on Ryu's shoulder, as though his thoughts had nothing to do with her. Her ruby-like eyes sparkled, lost in their own world. Ryu could only inwardly sigh. He had never lost a battle of words in this life or his last, but to think he would lose to someone who said no words at all. Was this what it meant for their souls to share a wavelength? Could someone else have forced Ryu to admit his faults so easily? Ryu was unsure. The only other person to succeed was Elena. Elena was probably the only woman in existence before Ailsa to make Ryu put down his stubbornness. However, Ryu felt that there was something deeper to this. It wasn't that Ailsa understood Ryu so well, although that might be it in part. It was more so maturity. Ailsa had a level of maturity that was far beyond Ryu and Elena. Just how long had she waited for Ryu in order to foster such a mind state? HMPH. Ailsa pouted, turning her head away from Ryu. Even thinking about asking how old a woman is a punishable offense. How rude. Ryu bitterly shook his head. Maybe she wasn't so mature after all. Well, at least she was speaking to him again. Thank you, Vaya. Ryu bowed in respect to this small family of 2. I'll use them well. Vaya waved his hands, as though trying to refuse Ryu's bow. He wanted to say something more, but before he could, Ryu had disappeared like a wisp of smoke. Bowing his head wasn't something Ryu did often. Even for his parents, it was a rare sight. However, Vaya and his father had taught him a valuable lesson. They might be unaware of this fact, but Ryu was still grateful nonetheless. Ailsa smiled with satisfaction. An outsider might see her attempts to enlighten Ryu as her forcing her belief system upon him. But this wasn't her intention. She didn't want Ryu to suddenly believe that faith was infallible. She only wanted him to understand that swimming against its current was far more difficult than he believed it to be. If he didn't learn this lesson early on, he would fall into an abyss he could never climb out of in the future. This was the ability of cultist fairies. They couldn't just nurture strength. They could nurture the mind and the heart. What Ailsa had done for Ryu was more valuable than any power-up could be. Ryu left Valor City behind, entering deep within its surrounding beast-ridden forest. If others knew just how much money he had spent in the last few days, they might die shocked deaths. Even with all of the gold coins he had come with, he blew through more than 90% of it in the blink of an eye. But it was very much worth it. Ryu slid his black robes off before putting on a sparkling light blue skin-tight flexible armor. It was constructed with iceworm silk and was incredibly cool to the touch. Though the iceworm silk was incredibly tough and sturdy, not many could wear armor made of its material, because the yin kai it emitted was fierce. If one wasn't careful, they could become a block of ice. Luckily, Ryu had begun to cultivate vital kai, while he waited for the Ember Clan father-son duo to complete his weapons. As a result, his slumbering bloodlines had partially awakened. With his ice phoenix blood beginning to come into its own, cold wasn't something Ryu would have to worry about in most cases. Ryu breathed out, the layer of frost that had covered his eyelashes melting away in the wind. After overlaying a new set of black robes to cover his defensive treasure, Ryu began to move once more, his movements filled with purpose. His destination, the Awoken Moon Sect, the very sect Granny Miriam's younger sister called her own. The Awoken Moon Sect. It was a land ravaged by cold year-round. However, if one looked around, you could find a surprising number of individuals trekking its perpetual winter landscape. If one looked once more, you might raise an eyebrow at the fact all of these brave individuals were men. That said, if you had heard of the Awoken Moon Sect before, you would understand what was happening at a single glance. The Awoken Moon Sect was an all-female sect. When this reality is known, one can either understand the situation or become more confused. The Awoken Moon Sect wasn't like other sects which had strict and infrequent disciple-accepting periods. It simply didn't have the luxury of doing so. According to rumors, the techniques and legacies of its sect were incredibly difficult to grasp, and as such, there were a rare few that could be admitted. As such, the sect held disciple exams once a month on the day and night of the full moon. And when this day arrived, men from across the outer ring would gather, all to catch mere glimpses of the femme fatales hidden behind those tall, white and blemishless walls. These annoying loaches, is there really a need for them to come here every month? A beauty with a snarl that didn't match her appearance nearly growled out her words. It truly wasn't her fault. Anyone would be annoyed beyond belief. Don't they realize that they look more like dogs than men? A woman might like a bit of persistence, but too much is just disgusting. The beauty was short in stature and quite petite. She didn't look more than 14 years old, but she spoke in the vulgar fashion one might expect a disgruntled middle-aged divorcee to. She stood on the tall white walls of their Awoken Moon Sect, trying to pick out the hopeful young girls in the crowd of hormonal men. She needed to make sure that none of those beasts harmed their delicate flowers, or else there would be hell to pay. Let's start filtering them out. Open the gates. A much taller, more mature disciple directly ignored the young girl's ravings. Make sure not to let those who shouldn't be here in. Leave it to me, senior sister. I'll definitely bust their balls properly. The teenage girl seemed more excited than she should have been. Who knew where she learned such words from? She fluttered downward gracefully, snorting at the calls of admiration from the crowd of men. Though it did satisfy her vanity a bit. This way, kiddies. The young girl completely ignored the fact that many of those who came were actually older than she was. You vulgar beasts, stay back. Only those prepared to take on our Awoken Moon Sect's trials should come forward. You've seen your fill, you can leave now. We are a mighty 5th Order sect, not your playgroup. Hey you, what do you think you're due? The young girl froze. The gaze in Ryu's eyes almost didn't allow her to continue on with her normal rant. Maybe for the first time in her young life, she was speechless. The young girl shook her head fiercely, slapping herself awake from Ryu's intoxicating scent. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to remove the fog from her eyes entirely. Though Ryu's scent was part of it, the other part were his eyes. In the past, a large part of the reason Ryu didn't dare to open his eyes casually was because it was very likely an individual could lose their minds looking into them for too long. Ryu's pupils held the mysteries of the heavens themselves. With them, he could see even the fate of those around him. That wasn't the kind of burden just anyone could withstand, especially since he was no longer in the expert-filled shrine plane anymore. It seemed that even with xianxia shielding the true depth of his heavenly pupils, it was still possible for him to shake people to their cores, especially those who were innately more sensitive than others. It seemed this little girl, despite her demeanor, was quite talented. "Amy, is there a problem?" Amy's senior sister saw the oddity from upon the tall white walls. Well, it was more accurate to say that she heard the oddity. This was the longest span of time she had gone without hearing her little junior sister's voice. Hearing her senior sister call out to her, Amy finally shook herself awake fully, a deep fear taking root in her large, immature eyes. Those men who had come just to beauty watch stepped forward valiantly. It was obvious that they hadn't felt what Amy felt. They just assumed she was smitten by Ryu's handsome appearance. To swindle a little girl like this, just because you were born a bit good-looking. They were pissed off to the point of immediately jumping upon their figurative white horses. Fairy me, this bastard is taking advantage of Fairy Amy. We saw it with our own eyes. Of course, me wasn't so easily fooled. However, when she saw the flustered appearance of her little junior sister, her cold exterior gave way to anger. She was very protective of little Amy. Her frown only deepened when her gaze landed on Ryu, who was in the process of entering the large white gates, especially when she realized she couldn't see through his cultivation. If xianxia could hide his heavenly pupils in plain view, it was obvious she could do the same for other things. "Who are you, and why have you come to our awoken moon sect?" Ryu shifted his gaze from Amy, who felt as though a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She almost directly collapsed to the ground. "Is it not obvious? It's your sect's disciple accepting period, and I've come to partake." Mi's brows wrinkled. "Our awoken moon sect is a female-only sect." Ryu smiled lightly, but it only made me more uncomfortable. "I never said that I wanted to apply to become a normal disciple." The ravings of the crowd of men grew worse at Ryu's words. They had never seen a person as shameless as him. Come to join a female-only sect as a man, then still not admitting your wrongs even after you've been exposed. Though as fellow men, they had to hand it to him. This was definitely the most unique way they had seen to get close to the moon fairies. At the very least, it was more creative than just appearing here every month and hoping for a different result. However, Mi's reaction was completely different. Her pupils constricted into pinholes and her heartbeat sped up, causing her still developing chest, despite already being Ryu's age, to heave. It was a sight that could make a man's heart palpitate with excitement. "Why you can't mean?" "That's right. I'd like to challenge your sect for the right to take the title of throne." In that moment, even the rowdy crowd of men fell into a dead silence. Their hearts that once beat only for the moon fairies suddenly beat for an entirely different reason. Throne. It was a title that had existed since the beginning of time, and was an esteemed label given to only the greatest. According to ancient lore, the title of throne was once held by angels. Some called them the deity race, others called them celestials, and still others labeled them as the deus. Still, no matter what name you knew them by, you recognized them as a mighty race that stood even about the ancient beasts. This was what the title throne represented. It was a person who stood above all things, even the rules of the sect itself. An untouchable being. Laymen believed the disciple rankings to be simple. If one was lowly, you would begin as a working disciple. You could then work your way up to the outer sect, then proceed to the inner sect, before maybe becoming a core disciple. Many believed that there was only one pinnacle following this, and that was to become an inheritor, an individual who had the right to fight for a future position as sect master. But this wasn't the case. There was one more position ranked even higher than that: the throne. One who held the title of throne was untouchable within a sect. They could use resources as they pleased, browse techniques as they pleased, converse with elders, and even the sect master herself as they pleased. They could wring a sect dry of all it was worth as long as they followed a single rule: to not harm the sect's bottom line. One must wonder why a sect would allow such a ridiculous thing. To allow an individual in who wouldn't have to follow the normal rules of a sect in would be akin to shooting yourself in the foot. No, even if that person was incredibly talented, they had no obligation to your sect. They wouldn't even have to raise a hand to help you in the future. However, this was where the martial world's most important concept shone the brightest: faith. A throne only had one duty, and that was to explosively increase the faith of a sect or clan. Clans and sects took thousands to millions and even billions of years to accumulate faith. How was it done? By scoring numerous achievements, conquering impossible tasks, defeating unbeatable opponents, and writing a legend that stretched throughout time. Eventually, a sect or clan would slowly grow as a result of their accumulated achievements. Birthing geniuses would become easier and more likely. They'd receive protection from natural disasters, and their longevity would increase. Thrones were a shortcut. If the talent of an individual surpassed the normal condition of a sect or clan by enough, they'd be able to explosively increase their faith in a short amount of time. As a result, a sect or clan would be willing to accept short-term losses for the sake of long-term gain. However, nothing in this world was free. As appealing as the title of throne was, not just anyone could hold it, and the trials to grasp it were nigh impossible. Hundreds of individuals seemed frozen within the tundra-like landscape. They truly couldn't grasp whether Ryu was a fool, or if he was really capable of doing such a thing. The birth of a throne wasn't something one spoken about candidly, even if the requirements for becoming a throne here was much lower than the inner ring or the core region. A throne was still a throne. To put matters into perspective, no one would dare to guarantee that if the greatest geniuses of the core region came, that they'd lay claim to a throne title, even if their positions were ones that usually looked down upon a mere fifth-order sect. Even in all their arrogance, they wouldn't dare to say such a thing. Yet here was Ryu, a man donned in black robes with white hair seemingly disappearing within the fallen snow, confidently smiling as though it was just another day. In the entirety of our pedestal plane, there are only two other thrones, tens of billions of individuals, whittled down to just two. Me bit her lower lip. Even then, before those two, it had been several 100,000 years since the last throne appeared on our plane. Now suddenly a third wants to lay claim to the title. Is it coincidence? Or is it that the tale of those two emboldened others to risk their lives? Becoming a throne didn't just represent unmatched talent and battle prowess. It also represented an unyielding spirit. Thrones were loners, individuals who would rather stand above the world than hold hands with it. There was no doubt that a throne here could easily enter some of the best sects and clans on the higher Blossom Plane. Yet they turned down such a path. A challenger to our sect's throne. In that moment, a voice as soft as clouds, yet as powerful as a mountain, cut through the quiet atmosphere. Me and Amy were shaken out of their thoughts, their necks practically snapping in the direction the voice came from. Heiress. The two core disciples lowered their heads and all but knelt to the ground. They knew that their sect's inheritor often oversaw the disciple trials, mostly as a precaution against the rowdy men and as a warning to those who deemed to cross a line they shouldn't. But she never appeared. However, the moment she did, everyone lost their breaths for a completely different reason: beauty. Her hair was a long black that sank to just above her waist, but it sparkled with a silver light that made her feel ethereal. Her neck was long and slender, leading to a delicate face lined by gentle, soft slopes. She wasn't very tall, more than a head shorter than Ryu, but her presence and demeanor made her seem larger than life. A blue gown graced her curves, following the contours of her body and giddily clinging to her. With the help of the whipping cold winds, those of weaker will couldn't help but swallow dryly, whenever a particularly strong gust forced her dress to press firmly against her. This woman was Heiress Melody, the sole inheritor of the Awoken Moon sect and Granny Miriam's younger sister. Ryu knew this the moment he laid eyes on her. The faint pang of a guilty conscience weighed on him. If it wasn't for him, would she have lost a sister? Probably not. Granny Miriam was beloved by all. If it hadn't been for him, she would have lived for much longer. She wouldn't have died like a criminal, with her name slandered and thrown in the mud. Ryu knew that Heiress Melody was most definitely already aware about her sister's death. This wasn't because of some arbitrary power like a sixth sense, but rather due to their special bone structure. Granny Miriam, before her death, told Ryu about the constitution she shared with her younger, twin sister. It was called the causal gate bone structure. Essentially, the fates of the two sisters were tied as one, but not in any obvious way. Both twins were born with an earth-grade bone structure and bloodline, but Granny Miriam ended up losing her talent to her young sister because she had no interest in cultivation. As a result, Heiress Melody, through their shared bone structure, became a dual heaven-grade talent. Yes, Ryu recollected himself. I would like to challenge your sect's throne. You are aware that we are a female-only sect, correct? Thrones aren't restricted by such rules. This much is correct. However, I tell you this not to turn you away, but for your own sake. Our sect's legacies are difficult to grasp, but it is still true that it is far easier for women to comprehend them than for men to. If you have the talent to become a throne, there are better options for you. A person could become a throne of as many sects as they pleased, but doing so became far more difficult with each subsequent attempt. The point of a throne was to accumulate faith, but if that faith was split between sects, the value of a throne plummeted. Therefore, one had to prove they could support the faith growth of multiple sects at once. Since Melody knew this, she wanted Ryu to choose his first sect wisely because he may never get a second. Ryu paused. He seemed oblivious to the fact that many were shocked he could so easily converse with Melody. It was clear they had no idea he had a beauty far surpassing her on his shoulder. Instead, he was focused on the heiress' words. It seemed she was pitying Ryu, as though telling him not to feel guilty. She likely believed that Ryu had come here to pay back a debt he felt he owed to her elder sister. That is in part true, Ryu thought silently. I will make sure that you raise up and succeed in your goals, because I owe your sister my life. However, that is not my sole goal in coming to your sect either. Your Awoken Moon sect will be of great help to me. I believe that I am very compatible with your sect. I would like to try my luck, Heiress Melody. Melody did her best to hide her trembling. She knew that this young man was tied to her elder sister's death in some way, but she didn't feel that her sister had any animosity toward him. In fact, Ryu was wrapped endlessly with Miriam's love and affection. Granny Miriam spent her life helping others, so she never had a chance to make a family of her own. But she had taken Ryu to be her very own grandson, a young man she saw as her kin. This was why Melody wasn't hostile to Ryu, despite seeing a ring she so very clearly recognized on his finger. The connection she shared with her elder sister was very strong. Since her sister wanted to protect this little boy, she would protect him too. She had no idea that Ryu had come to uplift her, and not the other way around. If that is your choice, follow me. The Blossom Plain, core region. The strings being pulled by the Marshall Plain were quite long. However, a wrinkle in their plans had occurred. Just days ago, a small realm they had been making use of for many generations had suddenly vanished without word or warning. The most shocking part, it disappeared during a session cornered off by the mere pedestal plane. Meralda, explain yourself. A beautiful young woman stood with a bitter expression on her face. Her hair was done up in a messy bun, and she had a pair of odd glasses hiding her usually energetic eyes. These weren't a normal pair of spectacles, but were instead one that came with multiple layers of lenses. With them, Meralda's eyesight was beyond superhuman, even though it looked like she walked around with a telescope on her face. This woman was none other than the energetic exam overseer, that watched over Ryu's exam. She was a genius of the Blossom Plane, a step higher than Ryu's current pedestal plane. However, she definitely wasn't being treated as such currently. She stood alone on a podium in the middle of a grand room. It looked like a place a senate would come together to speak of law and order, but on a much larger scale. This place was known as the center, a place where powerful men and women came to flex their prestige. As for the maintaining of law and order it claimed to exist for, it was more of a joke. These individuals cared for nothing other than their own pockets. This care might extend toward their own clans and sects as well, but no further than that. This is what the Blossom Plane had devolved to after the destruction of the Shrine Plane, though you'd probably be killed for saying so. Esteemed elders, I have nothing I can say. Maralda lowered her head. I was simply overseeing the exam, as I usually do when everything with black. Everyone was forcibly teleported out and the small realm crumbled not long afterward. It's gone. Didn't I tell you, we shouldn't have allowed those pedestal plane swine to take part in the exam. Don't be ridiculous. We had to cast the net as wide as possible for the benefit of our goal. Then, doesn't this mean that it's been taken? Could it be that one of the examinees at that time gained the acceptance of the fairy who created that small realm? It must be so. Fairies wouldn't give up until they've found their lifelong mate. The small realm wouldn't have crumbled otherwise. But the question is, who is it? Maralda. Countless gazes turned toward the slightly eccentric young woman, expecting an answer. Maralda chewed her cherry lips. She didn't know what she should say. She knew from the very beginning that these elders only wanted to monopolize the strength of the fairies for themselves. In fact, they probably hoped that the young man or woman chosen would be from a lesser plane, despite what they said. If that was the case, he or she would be far easier to control. In truth, this was a double-edged sword. These individuals knew it was impossible to forcibly take a fairy away from its life partner, so they'd likely nurture and coax the person chosen. However, at the same time, this individual would be forced to become a pawn, no different from a slave. The issue was that she had heard it. She heard that young man call himself Ryu Tatsuya, a name filled with such strength and power that even she, who was born from a prestigious clan even within the Blossom Plains core region, felt her heart flutter. What should I do? What should I do? Maralda bit her lip harder. You were too free with your words. How could you not know the kind of power your name holds, the kind of fear it still strikes? The Tatsuya clan. If word of their successor reaches the martial plane, it was unknown what they would do. Maralda didn't believe that Ryu was a true blood member of the Tatsuya clan, but rather that he was a lucky young man who likely ran into a legacy they hid, and was thus granted permission to use their name. But even if this was the case, it wouldn't be taken lightly. Maralda turned her gaze upward, looking toward a particular collection of 8 seats that represented the greatest powers in this Blossom Plains core region. Of course, the person who her eyes laid upon was her very own grandmother. Deep within her gaze was a pleading for help. She didn't want to be the reason why an innocent little boy lost his life. The older woman sighed. Is there a need to press my granddaughter in this way? She said she knows nothing, so she knows nothing. Are you trying to say that my Dougal clan heiress is a liar? The faces of the various elders twisted. This unreasonable old woman was talking nonsense again. She really was too protective of her granddaughter. It was a miracle she even allowed this questioning in the first place. It was no surprise that the meeting came to an abrupt end not too long after. Maralda only repeated that she knew nothing and was finally allowed to leave. How many individuals were taking the exam at that time? One of the 8-seated heads suddenly asked. There were 236 youths taking the common grade exam, and 43 taking the black grade exam. The heads fell into contemplation. The common grade exam is just a cover-up. The only ones who matter are the black grade exam takers, because only they can reach the end of the exam and have a chance to be accepted by the fairy. Focus on those 43 for now. Find out their names, their backgrounds, and monitor them all. We still have to answer to the martial plane when this is all said and done. The center seemed to take a collective breath as one. Everything would be fine, even if they never found this individual, as long as the fairy who built the small realm was of a normal breed, maybe an inferior elemental fairy or pixie fairy. But if this fairy was a fisher fairy, capable of bringing an individual from the brink of death to full health, or a quibus fairy capable of controlling the dead, or a cultist fairy capable of nurturing history's greatest heroes, or any other member of the highest echelon of the fairy realm, such a person couldn't be left to grow alone. They had to be controlled or slaughtered. It was clear that Ryu needed to temper his mind more if he wanted to survive. He had to be more aware that he was no longer a scion respected by the highest immortal plane. To his enemies and those who would cause harm to him, he was a bug to either be controlled or stomped upon. Luckily, he had a teacher by his side, now in Ailsaw. She would slowly help mold his future path. Throne. The awoken moon sect was shaken. It wasn't so simple to meet the elders of a fifth order sect, but as an inheritor, Melody was of great help to Ryu. Currently, the duo stood in a castle carved of ice. Everything seemed to shimmer with the utmost purity, a purity only amplified by the refined beauty the awoken moon sect elders held even in their old age. "Have you tested him appropriately, Melody?" one elder asked. "I trust my little brother," Melody replied plainly. The elders looked toward Ryu in shock. They had never heard word of Melody having a little brother, and by all rights, Melody's parents should have passed away due to old age by now. They were mortals after all, so how could she possibly have a little brother? But the elders seemed to tacitly understand that Ryu was someone Melody wanted to protect. At the very least, that meant he wouldn't harm their sect. At these words, the elders began to observe Ryu in earnest from their ice thrones. "Young man." For the first time, the head, known as the castle master by their sect, spoke. She looked to be about 50 to 60 years old by mortal standards, but she had gentle eyes that made her look younger than she was. "I'm sure Melody has explained this to you already, but I must do my duty and ensure that you understand. Our sect isn't female only because we discriminate against men. It is rather because our legacy has a very high mortality rate when practiced by our male counterparts. Even if you have the talent to become our throne, it is unlikely that what we can give you will be of any great use." Ryu bowed his head slightly. "I will bring glory to the awoken moon sect." It was a strong and short response, one that made Ryu's feelings on the topic clear as day. The castle master sighed. "I hope you do get a chance to bring us glory alongside heiress Melody. So be it. By the power vested in me, I'll allow you to make an attempt at claiming our throne." Castle Moon shook slightly. It wasn't an uncomfortable, overbearing quake, but rather a gentle rising. In the next moment, Kai began to pour in from the surroundings, if they weren't already alerted before. The two other Fifth Order sects that ruled over the Valor City region, along with the Awoken Moon sect, would definitely be alerted now. Activating this formation only had one purpose, and one purpose alone. A portal appeared before Ryu, one that he didn't hesitate to step and disappear into. The elders sighed once more. "If he truly becomes our throne, the girls will gain quite the distraction." The elders laughed amongst themselves. "A young man shouldn't have such an intoxicating smell. It would be dangerous if I hadn't tempered my mental realm for so long. It would be a shame if such a handsome young man died so young." The elders fell into silence, watching as a projection of the throne realm lifted into the air. This wasn't a scene only the elders could watch. As disciples of the Awoken Moon sect, every woman within their walls had the right to see the birth of their throne. They would all watch as Ryu put his life on the line. Whether he would rise to glory or fall here, they'd be witness. When Ryu reappeared, he almost thought for a moment that he hadn't moved at all. It was the very same castle of ice. But soon he noticed the very stark difference. He was alone. No, not alone, but facing a Valkyrie-like woman. Not only was her aura valiant, but so was her armor and weapon. Her spear seemed carved of white dragon bone, and her armor came from the scales of that very same dragon. Clad in complete white, even her hair whipped about like snow in the wind. But there obviously wasn't any wind here. This violent gust was nothing but the pressure of her Kai. Ryu, every sect's throne trial is different, but they have the same basic test: combat prowess. Although there are other ways to grow a sect's faith, nothing is as effective as oppressive strength. You need to be able to display heaven-defying strength for your age. That's all. Ryu smiled. In that case, this will be simple. With Ailsa by his side, Ryu could unleash his full strength, as long as he didn't do something that obviously exposed his heavenly pupils. Like using their inner world spatial kai. In the open, he could use its other abilities freely, especially since he was in a separate realm now. Ryu stretched his arm out to his side. In the next moment, what could only be described as a weapon forged with aesthetics in mind appeared. A glaive with a body of violet black shimmered under the pure light of the castle of ice. It seemed completely out of place, exuding a violent aura in a place that should have been awash with purity. However, its blade was even more outrageous. It was large, just over 2 feet alone. It almost looked like the jaws of a black dragon. That's an Earth-grade weapon. The elders shook. A Kai refinement expert with an Earth-grade weapon. He should just be breaking in his first black-grade glaive. Not just that. Look at the materials it's made out of. The shaft, that's new moon ore. The blade, that's silver-thirsting ore, new moon ore. It was a peak black-grade ore with exceptional Kai absorption capabilities and regeneration abilities. It was capable of absorbing its owner's Kai to grow stronger over time and repair itself. This was why it was called New Moon. It had the potential to progress to full moon from empty, silver-thirsting ore. It was an evolving type ore. Its silver stage was of the lower earth grade and grew sharper based on the blood it tasted. A blade that continuously grew stronger in battle. Ryu swung lightly, slicing through the aura of the white-clad Valkyrie. Almost 2,000 jin. If it was before, this would definitely be too heavy for me. But now, Ryu's knees sunk quickly. He didn't wait for the Valkyrie to take the initiative. As he propelled himself forward, his body seemed to meld into the air itself, his gliding cloud steps operating on a higher plane than even its creator thought possible. Fast, the elders who had been skeptical suddenly felt smiles hanging from their faces. They saw the light at the end of the tunnel. Ryu appeared before the unmoving Valkyrie in a flash. This was the first time he had battled someone using a weapon he was familiar with. He was curious to find out how the spearmanship disciplines of others stacked up to his Tatsuya clan. Suddenly, the Valkyrie awoke, a blinding flash of white light emitting from her body. The throne of the awoken moon sect will not be touched. Her voice was cold as her spear moved. The stroke was elegant, carving through the air and holding an air of beauty shrouding a piercing killing intent. Ryu's pupils seemed to see everything in slow motion. Every detail, every flex of her muscle, every slight tremble of her pointed spear, he saw it all. "Your spear is lacking," Ryu said coldly, his glaive raised, executing a perfect pair. The Valkyrie might have shown surprise if it wasn't for the fact she was an artificial being. Losing control of her own spear so easily would be a jarring experience for anyone, let alone someone speaking so arrogantly just a moment before. When next Ryu's glaive fell, the battle was over. A slice descended from the skies, a move that couldn't have been any more basic. But it was impossible for the Valkyrie to react. With her spear having been sent away from her body, there were too many openings to attack. She was bisected in the next instant. The elders were stunned. I know that this is just the first phase, but is it meant to be so easy, Castle Master? No, this Ryu is simply that talented. The Castle Master spoke solemnly. He acted as if he knew how the Valkyrie would attack before the battle began. It's either he has an extreme amount of battle prowess, or he's incredibly familiar with the spear. The battle for the throne uses the most talented disciples of our sect's history as a base, but limits their battle prowess to how strong they were at the trial taker's age. Many of our former ancestors have projections within this trial. The elders sucked in a cold breath. It had been so long since anyone had challenged their sect's throne that they forgot these details. It was impossible for the awoken moon sect's throne trial to be simple because, Castle Master, doesn't that mean? One of the sect's grand elders spoke. Heiress Melody's jaw clenched slightly as the beginning of this elder's inquiry, but she kept her eyes glued to the image above her head. silently supporting Ryu. Yes, the castle master said softly. Our awoken moon sect was once a ninth order sect of the Blossom Plane. However, the collapse of the Shrine Plane cut the support we once had from the Ice Phoenix clan off, resulting in excess pressure from our enemies, which eventually led to our downfall. This means that if little Ryu wants our throne, he'll have to face ancestors that stepped into the cosmic seed realm at their peak. Castle Master, the elders froze in shock. Of the collective elders, only their 3 grand elders and Melody as their sect inheritor were aware of this truth. But they were all thinking one thing. Shouldn't we have told the boy this before he entered? It wasn't lost on the elders that their castle master had suddenly shifted to calling Ryu an affectionate little Ryu. Though her eyes were gentle, these elders knew well that their castle master was a scary woman who was once known as the ice ghost of the battlefield. The fact she was showing any sort of affection toward Ryu meant that she was attaching a small bit of hope in him, hope to rise their sect back up to their former glory. Little Melody was already aware of this truth and still allowed him to enter. I believe that she knows, or at least felt something that we have to trust. Even though she said this, the pulsing ring, seemingly made of beautiful blue marble, on her forefinger told Castle Master Toria a completely different story, one that would change everything. At this moment, the second challenger was appearing before Ryu, who had a slight smile on his face. Did he know the connection this awoken moon sect had with his grandmother's Ice Phoenix clan? Of course he did. That was why he chose it. In truth, he wasn't absolutely certain before. But after seeing their white dragon bone spear and armor, he became absolutely certain. They were the heirlooms only this sect could have. Ryu was certain that they no longer had these treasures in their possession. Though they weren't actually made of dragon bone and scales, they were still too valuable as mystical-grade treasures. The only way they'd be allowed to survive until now is if they willingly gave them up. But this throne trial was still able to project the abilities of those treasures onto their ancestors. To claim their throne, Ryu would have to defeat every ancestor the awoken moon sect had in their long history during their 18th year of life. It would likely begin with the weakest and work its way upward. So the enemies he faced now were most likely the more recent ancestors of the sect. He could tell. These ancestors weren't spearmen. The trial was forcing them to use a spear when they had likely never used one in their lives. It was no wonder the first was full of holes to exploit. This unfortunate trend continued onward. Due to the fact the sect had lost their heirloom, none of the first half-dozen ancestors survived past a single strike. The elders were starting to wonder if this so-called throne trial would really continue like this, while the disciples watching outside the castle of ice were in absolute shock. To use a glaive with one arm in this way, is he purposely handicapping himself? Or is this a style he is attempting to refine? I feel as though he is trying to hone something, but I can't understand what it is. The elders nodded faintly at these words. It really did seem that way. But they were too shocked by watching their ancestors fall with just a single strike again and again. However, the castle master's gaze shifted when Ryu entered his 7th battle. This is it. This is where it truly begins. The battles before this were from the ancestors we had as a 5th order sect. But now, they'll be 6th order sect ancestors. Women that would one day become immortal ring cultivators. Can you make it to the 9th order? Ryu immediately felt the change and swapped his weapon, revealing a spear that matched his glaive in almost every way. Finally, someone who can use a spear. Show me your skill. The faces of the elders stiffened. Even though Ryu's use of the glaive was odd, there was no doubt he was familiar with the weapon. Was it wise to suddenly change weapons, and to the weapon that their ancestors used at that? Was it even possible for someone so young to be proficient with 2 weapons? However, the next clash washed their worry away with shock. Ryu's arm arched forward, matching the pace of the Valkyrie beat for beat. The strike was so precise that both of their weapons stalled, their tips perfectly pushing against one another. It has to be a coincidence, right? The elders muttered. But then it happened again. Ryu's spear read and reacted to the flow of the Valkyrie, causing their tips to clash perfectly for several consecutive blows. Even a bowman splitting an arrow wasn't as impressive as what they were witnessing now. How could such a level of precise control even be possible? For Ryu, who spent so much of his time practicing the Kunnan and Tatsuya martial forms, this was the least he expected of himself. The Kunnan martial form focused on speed and explosiveness, zeroing in all small, fast twitch muscles. The Tatsuya martial form emphasized the lower body and bones, pushing for stability and power. The combination of the two resulted in a perfectly sculpted body that was both quick and precise. Still, Ryu wasn't doing this to show off. He was devouring this ancestor's comprehension of the spear. He knew he needed to understand more. He needed to absorb more to truly refine his way of the spear. Your approach isn't bad, Ailsa commentated calmly. It seemed that sitting on Ryu's shoulder, even during an intense battle, didn't bother her one bit. But the most important thing you can do for your dreams of dual wielding is expanding your mental realm. The second most important thing will be comprehending the legacy hidden within the northern heavenly wind. Ailsa had become less standoffish after the matters with the Ember clan father-son pair. It seemed she had begun to nurture him in earnest, though her ability to do so was limited due to her intimacy levels, with Ryu still being marginal at best. A cultist fairy was able to nurture, but there was nothing in existence it had a greater ability to nurture than her life partner. A cultist would naturally comprehend the best path to improvement for their life partner. Unfortunately, the road Ailsa could see for Ryu was foggy. She couldn't see very far ahead, so the guidance she could give as of now was superficial. Still, she wasn't completely useless. Every cultist fairy innately had information about the more famous and faith-laden treasures and abilities. Ryu's pupils were too rare for her to know much, but the origin flame and northern heavenly wind had existed for so long that her species had gathered a lot of information on them. In these lanes, she would be able to guide Ryu. Ryu nodded faintly, taking Ailsa's advice. He couldn't promise her the level of intimacy she wanted, but he could ensure that no matter what, she could watch her life partner reach the very peak of all that was. In that way, her duty would be completed, and at least one aspect of her dreams would be fulfilled. If this is all you have left, Ryu's spear trembled, its speed multiplying. It'll end it. The Valkyrie had no time to react before her throat was pierced. He toyed with her. The elders coughed uncomfortably. Ryu's win here meant that he had more potential than anyone in their sect aside from Heiress Melody, who was their hope to climb back up to the sixth order once more. He's not using anything aside from the spear's basic stances. Ryu didn't seem perturbed as he turned his spear toward the eighth Valkyrie, repeating his tactics as though to give the elders and disciples a sense of déjà vu. Maybe it was only now the elders began to realize that, while the Valkyrie were using the legacies of their sect, Ryu was using nothing but the very basic stances anyone could learn. In truth, this test was almost too unfair. For the youthful ancestors, that was. Women had weaker physiques than men did. To make matters worse, they were Ryu's age, so they didn't have the accumulated cultivation to counter this with Kai. As the geniuses of mere 5th and 6th order sects, Ryu's Kai was already purer than theirs despite only cultivating for 4 years. This wasn't all either. Ryu had 4 ancestral-grade bloodlines, though their true strengths wouldn't begin to manifest until the divine vessel realm. When it came to body realm cultivation, some of their prowess had already begun to be seen. When Ryu finished opening his body pulses, he was surprised to find that he had 2,000 jin of strength. This was because normally, after opening 6 body pulses, one's threshold of strength would be between 500 and 1,000 jin. It wasn't until recently Ryu understood the reason he differed from others. Different bloodlines had different capacities for absorbing vital Kai. Ryu had 4 ancestral-grade bloodlines, so his limits were far above that of others. In order to enter the next body realm, one had to saturate his blood with vital Kai. Normally, this would cap out at 50,000 jin. However, Ryu had already reached 10,000 jin of strength after just 3 days of absorbing beast spiritual root blood essence. Yet he couldn't see the end of his limits. Of course, this speed was in part due to his mother's phoenix heavenly body, and in other part due to the vast amounts of spiritual roots he had accumulated during his stay in Ope's kingdom. His bloodlines almost made Ryu lament that he wasn't born with a body suited for body realm cultivation. Had he had his father's bone structure, it would have been perfect. However, he was already far above the standards of most others, and definitely far above what these ancestors were capable of at his age. Ancestors began to fall like flies. After the first 6th-order ancestor fell, Ryu took down the others more quickly, mostly because he didn't see anything worth comprehending in their spearmanship. There were some exceptions, but for the most part, this was the reality. Still, Ryu didn't get complacent. On the shrine plain, those his age were already prepping themselves to attack the divine vessel realm. Though the Awoken Moon sect was only a Blossom Plain sect at its peak, around Ryu's age, their geniuses would still have likely already stepped into the spiritual severing realm, almost as if to confirm this coming reality. After losing count of the number of ancestors he had forced into submission, the very first of the 7th-order ancestors appeared, and her cultivation, unlike Ryu's, was truly in the higher Kai refinement realm. Whew! A cold breath left Ryu's lips. It was about time. This throne trial pushed him to his limits. Ryu clashed with the 7th-order ancestor, sending several pierces. However, unlike the previous rounds, it seemed that Ryu was finally at a disadvantage. This was simply the reality of the matter. If he insisted on using his spear with a single arm, he would only barely pull out a 20th of his strength. It was impossible to use that level to defeat someone 2 cultivation stages above him. Still, even as he was slowly forced backward, Ryu's eyes continued to shine, taking in aspects of this ancestor's spearmanship for himself. The elders began to grow nervous. Even Castle Master Toria fiddled with the ring on her finger. If Ryu was struggling now, how could he stand up to the 8th and 9th-order ancestors? After all, this was only the weakest of the 7th-order ancestors. Ryu, however, was calm. His phoenix martial forms gave him an unyielding level of stamina. Just the few dozen fights he had gone through until now wasn't enough to put a dent toward his fatigue. At the same time, the strong blows of this ancestor weren't making it past his ice silk protective armor. Still, this is my limit here. It seems I need to take it up a single notch. Ryu's eyes glowed a fierce silver light. Third perspective. Suddenly, the world seemed to enter the palm of Ryu's hand. The unreadable movements of the ancestor felt as though they had slowed to a snail's pace. The secrets, no, the mysteries of her spearmanship all lay bare before him. Ailsa's brow twitched at this sudden change. This is the true state of the first-ranked heavenly pupils. This cool Kai, it seems life partner hasn't realized yet. Ryu's feet shifted, his soles gliding across the ice beneath his feet as he marginally dodged the tip of a coming spear. In the next instant, the tip of his spear trembled, shooting past an impossibly small window to pierce the Valkyrie's throat. His hand snapped outward, decapitating her directly. Before the Awoken Moon sect elders could even comprehend what had happened, Ryu had already moved on to the 2nd 7th-order ancestor. Third perspective was too useful. It allowed Ryu to see the battlefield from angles his opponent could never imagine. This blew flaws that would otherwise be hidden wide open. To gain that sort of battle perspective would usually take countless years on a battlefield, but Ryu was gifted it simply by virtue of his heavenly pupils. It seemed Ryu owed Ailsa once more. If it wasn't for her, he'd never use it so freely. It was at this moment that curious observers began to approach the Awoken Moon sect. Considering how quickly they made it here, their cultivations were definitely not low. In fact, they were the elders of the Awoken Moon sect rival sects. Unfortunately for them, the sect had been shrouded by a wall of white mist that perfectly blended into the snowy landscape. Could it be Thale really gain themselves a throne? The elders muttered to themselves, deep frowns commonplace on all their faces. The pedestal plane was just preparing to undergo many changes. The addition of a third throne would shift the balance once more. The other thrones could be ignored since they had taken up positions in the core region. But for a throne to appear in their outer ring, it was troublesome. According to observers from before they put up their sex formation, he was a male. Why would a male want to join this sect? It can't be that his talent in womanizing is greater than his cultivation talent, right? Let's hope that that's the case. If he's made such a foolish decision, there likely isn't much to worry about. A man won't be able to gain much from the awoken moon sect. We've likely worried for nothing. Still, we need to comprehend his limits appropriately. You all know as well as I do that the higher-ups won't be fond of the awoken moon sect improving their station. If they do, the ones who'll be blamed is us and no one else. What are we supposed to do? An elder responded with an annoyed tone. We're not allowed to directly attack them, but we still have to hinder them. What kind of nonsense is that? The elders fell into silence, each of them having their own theories. In fact, many of them were close to the truth. If the awoken moon sect was once a higher order sect, even in their decline, the faith protecting them was not a joking matter. The truth was that those who sought to oppress the awoken moon sect weren't afraid of their faith, but rather the faith of the Ice Phoenix clan that had once protected them. If that slumbering faith was stirred, none of them would survive. Many laymen believed that the shrine plane had been destroyed, but this wasn't the case. The shrine plane was sealed. Why? Because even the rulers of the martial plane couldn't finish the job. They had no choice but to bide their time, waiting for the accumulated faith of the shrine plane's finest to slowly dwindle. In order for this to happen, they needed to make sure that the subordinate sects and clans of those shrine plane powers no longer had a leg to stand on. To now, many of them had been forced into dormancy, disbanded or destroyed, but more stubborn ones like the awoken moon sect continued to hold on. In any case, he's young. A once silent elder spoke. Whether he is talented or not is irrelevant. Sometimes there are things even geniuses cannot do without enough time. And since he's a throne, we won't have to worry about faith backlash if we kill him. The role of a throne was a double-edged sword. You were free from the constraints of a sect's rules, and you could use their resources as you pleased. But for this very reason, you didn't have the protection of the sect's faith. Since you chose to walk alone, using your own talent to hold you up, you would be alone to the very end. Ryu, even as he felled ancestor after ancestor, was well aware that he had placed a target on his back. But he had done so purposefully. He wanted this pressure, a pressure so heavy that it threatened to sink him to his knees. Only this way could he grow as fast as he needed to. He didn't want to grow complacent, nor did he want to forget what he was fighting for. Pushing himself into a corner in this way would be his own martial path. Ryu took a strong step forward, his kai pouring into his spear as he faced the final 7th Order ancestor. His spear curled forward, blurring in the air into a smear of violet and black coated in a thick white. In the next moment, he retracted his attack, 3 bloody holes signaling the collapse of the Valkyrie. He projected his kai. The elders felt as though they were watching the creation of a legend. Emitting kai from one's body was something that could only be done with the help of a natural order. The only way to do it without one was to have incredibly pure kai and high kai control. Usually, one wouldn't enter this threshold until they had solidified their place within the spiritual severing realm. Thus the reason why flight became possible only in that realm. However, the sharp-eyed elders noticed that Ryu's reach hadn't been enough to kill the final 7th Order ancestor. In order to compensate, he extended his blade with his kai. It was only a couple inches, something that was so minor that those of lower cultivations likely completely missed it. But these elders definitely wouldn't. Many gripped their seats. This young man, he was worthy of being a throne. A hot, steamy breath left Ryu's lips. New Moon ore had excellent kai absorption abilities, but it was gentle and slow in its task, making it comfortable to strengthen with kai. However, silver-thirsting ore was tyrannical. Ryu had to be careful when he poured his kai into it. Otherwise, it would suck him dry. Others might see Ryu's actions as reckless, but he took this path after deciding to follow Ailsa's advice once more. Good. This is a nice and natural way to do it. The innate kai of your heavenly pupils isn't one you should ignore. It'll be a great strength to you. Ailsa felt a slight swelling of satisfaction when Ryu listened to her wishes so easily. She knew he was only doing it to get stronger, but it still made her feel warm. When Ailsa first brought up this cool kai to him, Ryu thought back to when he was running for his life. His embryonic origin flame didn't just help sharpen visual memories, but memories of all kinds. Ryu realized then that this cool kai wasn't foreign to him. It had actually already helped him many times. According to Ailsa, every pair of heavenly pupils had a special kai tied with them, a kai that one without the proper eyes could never tap into. Usually, one wouldn't have a chance to reflect on this kai until you had reached a certain stage with your pupils, but it seemed that Ryu completing his rite of origin had accelerated the process. That day when you completed your last rite, you heard a series of popping noises from your eyes. Those noises represent seals. Heavenly seals every heavenly pupil user must unlock. From an inspection of your body, it seems you've undid one seal per eye, while there is a total of 999 in each. This gave you access to your special kai. I cannot teach you the uses of this kai. Our intimacy is not high enough, so I cannot feel what you feel clearly enough. The mysteries of heaven and earth pupils are very much that, a mystery. The only way for you to comprehend this kai is by forcing it out and comprehending its uses yourself. Ryu agreed with Ailsa's assessment. As of now, he was only aware that this kai calmed his mind and strengthened his focus. In truth, if this was the end of it, Ryu would be satisfied. The ability to calmly analyze a battlefield and bring out your peak strength no matter the situation was invaluable. Third perspective. Ryu's eyes focused. His next opponent was yet another white-clad Valkyrie, however. What shocked Ryu was that he could very clearly see intelligence in her eyes while the others had none. The Valkyrie smirked. A lower kai refinement stage baby wants to challenge me. Her aura was oppressive. She was truly worthy of being a top genius of an 8th order sect. Even at such a young age, she had already completed her 13th revolution and entered the half-step spiritual severing realm. The earth itself seemed to quake in her presence. Lower kai refinement. The elders shot gazes toward Eris Melody. None of them had been able to sense Ryu's cultivation when he entered. They had assumed he had some sort of treasure that hid this from them and didn't mind it. But if this was true, it was too shocking. With Ailsa pouring her everything into protecting the secret of his pupils from others, there really wasn't much of a point in wasting power on hiding his cultivation in this situation. So it was no wonder why this seemingly sentient Valkyrie had seen through Ryu. It seemed her experience was much higher than those Valor Guards who believed Ryu was a higher kai refinement expert. The white-clad ancestor's white bone spear shook, emitting a fierce light. Spear kai. The castle master's jaw nervously clenched. This opponent might truly be too powerful. For Ryu to face someone who had comprehended their sex-birthed phenomena, it was trouble. However, Ryu smiled. Insight, third perspective, allowed him to see the battlefield from almost any angle. Insight practically allowed him to see the future. This was Ryu's first time fighting someone who had comprehended a natural order. No, two natural orders. As Ryu was thinking this, the temperature of the already ice-made castle began to continuously fall as the air around the Valkyrie seemed to freeze. Not only had she comprehended the spear-birthed phenomena of the awoken moon sect, she had also comprehended the ice elemental. And heir of spear and ice. You are the perfect opponent. Ryu's blood began to churn. His ice phoenix bloodline completely negated the drop in cold, this inferior frigid air. It meant nothing. In that moment, a second spear appeared in his hand, causing even the arrogant Valkyrie across from him to look on in shock, before bursting into a laughter that simmered into a deep rage. You dare to insult the way of the spear in this way. It'll destroy you in body and soul. Ryu was indifferent to her reaction. He didn't care how anyone reacted. This was his martial way. He would follow it until he alone decided it was either a success or a failure. A battle erupted. It was clear the 8th Order ancestor was surprised to see that Ryu's spearmanship was far better than she thought. However, whenever she saw his awkward movement, she would settle into a rage once more. Still, no matter how hard she pressed, she couldn't seem to deal Ryu a fatal blow. It was as though he was constantly several steps ahead of her. Unfortunately for him, his dual-wielding style was so unrefined that he couldn't take advantage of this truth. His power and balance were off, and his strikes often got in the way of each other. He looked like a toddler trying to get used to walking on his own. Focus. Ryu sought after that absolute realm. He entered Breath of Earth. Breath of Earth. It was a state of meditation. Many individuals felt they could only luck into and not seek. Within such a state, the difficult became simple, and the fast became slow, even though there were 9 total states of meditation. Entering the second, as Ryu had done, was seen as such a lofty goal that others never bothered to aim higher. However, after the first time he touched upon its barrier, Ryu always felt that he could enter Breath of Earth on a whim. He never really thought about why that was, nor did it particularly matter to him in his first life, because he was unable to cultivate. Sustaining Breath of Earth with his practically non-existent mental realm was nigh impossible, and even if he could enter it, there was little point to do so considering it wasn't, as though he had techniques to learn or cultivation stages to master. This life, though, things were very different. The ability Ryu had had even during his first life had become one of his sharpest tools. It intrigued him. The gaps in Ryu's defense narrowed as his spears became more fluid. Third perspective and insight. The truth was that there was a third. Focus. Ryu's heavenly pupils could see into the mysteries of heaven and earth, and even witness the stars of fate that dictated the lives of all who existed. Grasping the quintessence of a state of meditation was a simple task when these matters are put into perspective. Even within Breath of Earth, Ryu was still lacking. He had avoided numerous cuts thanks to his ice worm silk garments, but his black robes were in tatters, and though his defensive garments protected him, every strike that landed made him feel as though his inner organs were being knocked loose. Still, Ryu's face was serene. With a single weapon used with a single arm, 5% of my strength is still my limit. When I continue to 2 and enter Breath of Earth, I can bring out between 30 and 40%. But should I be practicing dual wielding in this way? Or should I be focusing on increasing my percentage strength with just one weapon? Ryu legitimately did not know. He didn't bring out his second weapon because he had an answer. He did so because restricting himself to a 20th of his strength would be asking for death in this situation. But at the same time, he didn't want to give up this perfect opportunity to temper his martial path. In the end, Ryu's eyes sharpened with resolve. If he didn't push himself here and now, when would he get another opportunity? Breath of heaven. Ryu's eyes glowed with a fierce light, so fierce in fact that the 8th Order ancestor unconsciously retreated. She felt danger. Ryu's spears whipped out from himself, their flat blades cutting through the air with a satisfying metallic sound. His body seemed to steam, a golden fog wafting with essence collecting around his body. If the elders weren't certain before, they were certain now. Somehow, Ryu had entered a deep enough state of meditation to call upon essence. God Emperor. The birthed phenomenon of the Tatsuya clan's saintly spear went by this name. A man of honor and war, but a man of cunning and intelligence at that same time. This was the true essence of his clan's spear. Layered and calculated attacks that slowly pushed one's enemy into a corner. More calculating. The light in Ryu's eyes grew fiercer. His bone structure was known for its flexibility and balance. It was the reason his mother was one of the best dual weapon wielders to ever exist. He had to tap into that feeling, to break the restrictions on his body, to stop moving so rigidly. But therein lied Ryu's problem. He had only learned the basic stances, movements, attacks and defenses that couldn't have been simpler. They restricted him into strong constraints that weren't easy to break out of. But, at the same time, their simplicity gave him a freedom other techniques could not. That feeling he had when he used Whipping Pierce for the first time. His life had been on the line, deep within the forest of Ope's kingdom. He had run into a 4th Order beast he had no chance of defeating. As a mere pulse-opening realm baby, standing before a beast 2 orders above his own, No one would have blamed him if he simply keeled over and accepted death. However, Ryu hadn't. He slipped into breath of heaven and tapped into a realm of fluidity he couldn't have imagined before. He stared down his opponent and bent his spear to his whim. Back then he felt as though his weapon was truly an extension of his arm, a limb he could do anything pleased with. Then again, when he faced Bishak, his spear had been pared, his right arm was useless, and he was facing a veteran of 10,000 battles. He felt that feeling once more, that feeling of control, of fluidity, of grasping the world in one's palm. Ryu's mental realm trembled. Others, after experiencing a virtuoso, would forget that feeling. They'd reach the pinnacle for a moment but never be able to grasp it again. However, Ryu was different. This time it wasn't because of his heavenly pupils, but because of his origin flame. Every moment he had ever lived through in his life could be brought before him with incredible clarity. That day that he managed to survive and run from a fourth-order beast, that split moment when his spear had become his arm, it was right before him once more. All he needed to do was reach out and Ryu's arm seemed to blur. The elders watched in astonishment as their ancestor, a valiant white-clad Valkyrie who had just been shredding Ryu to pieces, got pushed backward. His wrists flickered and his arms twisted, applying strength in angles that would have shattered the bones of anyone else. It was the picture of absolute beauty. For a split moment, a painting of unfathomable depth was born. This is it, Ryu. This feeling of fluidity, grasp it. This is your northern heavenly wind. Ailsa's voice rang. In that instant, something stunning occurred. A gentle beauty appeared to Ryu's back, wearing a smile that could soothe the hearts of the masses. Though she was slightly illusory, she had a presence that made her existence undeniable and an aura that made the skies themselves tremble. Ryu was enveloped by a golden-green wind. He felt that the heavens were bowing to him. The elders abruptly stood from their chairs. It didn't matter what had happened until now. This moment was probably the most shocking thing they had witnessed in their long lives. Wind of natural order. Among the heavenly winds, only it is worthy of such a lofty namesake. The southern wind was known as the breath of life. The western wind was known as the wind of tribulation, and the eastern wind was known as the wind of sharpness. But only the northern wind had the right to embody wind itself. Only it could encompass the natural order of wind and rule them all. However, it wasn't that the elders recognized its phenomena that they stood so abruptly. It was impossible for them, with such a narrow perspective of the world, to recognize the wind of natural order simply by this. Rather, it was the fact that a phenomena appeared at all that shocked them to no end. Within the natural order umbrella, there were two main divisions: natural enlightenment and mortal endowment. Within the mortal endowment umbrella, there were two more divisions: elements and birthed phenomena. Comprehension of mortal endowments were split into 7 tiers, each more imposing than the last. To be an heir and an inheritor, to impose and become a lord, to rule and be a ruler, to conquer a small realm and become a monarch, to hold a dominion and the title of sovereign, to form a divinity and become a minor god, and to become a deity and be known as a god. These 7 divisions were ingrained in the minds of all cultivators, because even the first step seemed impossible to achieve. It was to the point where these elders believed that Ryu had lost the moment. Their 8th-order ancestor displayed herself as an heir of ice and the spear, but this was on a completely different level. The earlier one could evoke a phenomena. The stronger the legacy they had comprehended. Not only was it stronger, but it was incredibly complex and difficult to reflect upon. Usually, one wouldn't expect to evoke a phenomena until one entered the rule realm and became a ruler. However, what many don't talk about is that this rule is only for birthed phenomena. Natural enlightenments and elements do not receive this kind of treatment. Theoretically, one could reach the deity realm and still never form a phenomena for their natural enlightenment or element. But it never worked this way. Humans had a lot of difficulty connecting with nature. Unless you had a special bloodline, it was almost impossible to comprehend an element to the impose realm, let alone ever reaching the deity realm. The reason was right before them. Humans faced a barrier when evoking the phenomena of elements. As a result, they couldn't leap over the final hurdles. In the past, this was the reason humans were so weak. In order to forge a better future for themselves, human ingenuity shone through as they created birthed phenomena, allowing them to gather strength toward themselves by mastering human-created arts instead of comprehending nature. To this day, phenomena represented the greatest strength cultivators had available to them. Comprehending a natural order already made it possible to rely on the heavens and essence to strengthen yourself. But evoking a phenomena took this to an even greater height. The Ryu of now and the Ryu of before were akin to heaven and earth. The Eighth Order ancestor's words never finished. She, a mighty half-step spiritual severing realm expert, fell before she could finish her thoughts. Massive, bloody holes appearing in her body. Ryu slipped off breath of heaven, breathing deep, raggedy breaths as the goddess that had appeared to his back slowly faded. A light smile still playing her features, xianxia waved her hand, collecting the dissipating essence and pushing it toward Ryu. Suddenly, Ryu's quickly drying mental realm was revitalized, causing him to look toward xianxia in surprise. However, the palm-length cultist sprite said nothing as she observed the appearance of the next Valkyrie. She had said that she could help Ryu's recoverability. Normally, individuals could only replenish their minds by sleeping or with incredibly rare herbs, but it seemed xianxia had a method to circumvent this to an extent. It was no wonder. One of the most important aspects of nurturing a person's growth was ensuring that they were properly rested and healed. Cultist fairies wouldn't be very good at doing their jobs if they could only break down their life partners and not build them back up. Still, xianxia's job was made far easier by using the rich essence Ryu had called down. Without his natural order, Ryu had no way of manipulating essence himself, so he could only helplessly watch as it dispersed. But xianxia wasn't Ryu. She didn't need to evoke a phenomena to manipulate essence when it was in such high concentration. "Thank you," Ryu said softly, before focusing on the task at hand once more. xianxia watched as Ryu's speed reached an ungodly level. His mastery over his embryonic heavenly wind had increased explosively in a short time. Even without calling down its phenomena, it responded to him as though it was a limb now. Ryu's gliding cloud steps began to manifest, as though it was an Earth-grade movement technique, instead of the common grade one it was. In fact, Ryu could now fly in the skies as freely as a fish in water, changing directions with a flexibility that made the minds of his opponents numb. This wasn't the best part in Ryu's estimation either, though he was used his heavenly wind making his body incredibly light. Now that his control was greater, this even extended to his weapons. Suddenly, his spears, which had weighed almost 2,000 jin each, had become as light as a feather. Unfortunately for his opponents, they didn't get to bask in this feeling. To them, they were just as heavy. No, they were even heavier because Ryu's striking speed had accelerated to blinding heights. The glove of order on Ryu's right hand vibrated with excitement. After Ryu comprehended a new natural order, it had once more morphed, coating his hand in a black knight-like gauntlet. However, Ryu had no time to pay attention to it as he felled ancestor after ancestor. The battles weren't easy because his mental realm wasn't sturdy enough to manifest his phenomena for extended periods of time. Ryu could only slowly whittle down his opponents as they became more and more powerful. It was then the air of his opponent changed. The atmosphere grew heavier, making it difficult to breathe, something that could only happen when facing an expert of a far higher caliber. A spiritual severing realm Valkyrie had appeared. At this moment, Ryu was thankful for the ice silk that covered his body. If it wasn't for it, his heaving lungs and screaming muscles would be even worse off without their cooling effect. Unfortunately, the challenge had just taken a major leap forward. Despite defeating numerous Eighth Order ancestors to this point, the first spiritual severing realm ancestor had appeared. Their bodies blurred, whether it was Ryu or the Valkyrie, their speeds reached past the realm of mortals. But, despite matching her speed, Ryu had no way to match her strength. There was no suspense. Ryu was sent flying back. Despite shifting his spear's shaft just enough to block a fatal blow, he didn't have the right to stand before the Valkyrie any longer. Ryu didn't crash as expected. The wind caressed his body, gently slowing his descent to the ground. I'm faster. My eyes can easily read her movements, but I don't have the strength. Ryu's calm exterior cracked, a slight frown coloring his features. This was only to be expected. Ryu hadn't even comprehended a black-grade technique before. His entire repertoire was made up of common-grade techniques. As for his attacks, they were even worse off. The basic stances weren't even categorized as common-grade. They were an entry set of simple moves, used to set a foundation for children who had yet to awaken. Without a high-grade technique, Ryu had no way of efficiently using his dense Kai. He could only allow his Kai to flow on instinct. Unfortunately, the silver-thirsting ore that made up his blade was eager to suck him completely dry. Ryu's frown disappeared like the wind, his calm countenance re-emerging. Hadn't Ailsaw told him to drain himself of his normal Kai, so that he could begin to comprehend his cool Kai? It seemed he didn't have much of a choice any longer. The Valkyrie watched with an interested expression on her face as the spears in Ryu's hand began to sing, thrumming with thick Kai. You aren't a spear heir, but the sharpness of your technique says different. The Valkyrie tilted her head in confusion. Ryu's skill with the spear was too high to not be a spear heir, but he wasn't using spear Kai. Instead, he was using normal Kai. Why was that? It confused her. How could she know that Ryu's skill in dual wielding wasn't as high as his single wielding style? He still wasn't capable of evoking his spear's birthed phenomena with only a single arm. It's probably because you've picked such a silly path. The Valkyrie decided indifferently. Either way, I have no intention of losing to a lower Kai refinement realm pup. The Valkyrie's spear thrummed to life, overshadowing Ryu's momentum in an essence. This was the true difference between a spear filled with normal Kai and one blessed by spear Kai. Their figures blurred once more. It didn't take long for the elders to realize that Ryu's use of Kai was excessive. He was using brute strength to match a spiritual severing realm expert, but there was no way that Kai refinement could. His Kai is incredibly dense for him to last so long. But it can't continue like this. The elders frowned. They knew that the 8th Order ancestor had yet to go all out. In fact, the ancestors to now had yet to use their sect's core teachings. Of course, there was a reason for this. The core teachings of a 9th Order sect weren't something an 18-year-old could comprehend. They would be of the earth grade at the absolute worst, while the minimum requirement to use such a high-grade technique was to be of the divine vessel realm. However, that didn't mean a spiritual severing realm genius would find it impossible to replicate the techniques, at least in part, especially one who had comprehended a birthed phenomena. As though to answer the worries of the elders, the Valkyrie's spearmanship sharpened, her attacks layering. A single spear Kai strand became 2, then 3. Her attacking speed spiked so suddenly that Ryu's already sharp disadvantage became worse in an instant. He could see the attacks plainly. The Valkyrie was almost moving in slow motion before his eyes. In fact, his body was able to easily keep up as well. The wind of natural order truly lived up to its name. However, his strikes had no power behind them. They were batted away with such ease that his opponent seemed to be toying with him. Soon, the situation took a turn for the worst. Ryu's ridiculous stores of Kai began to dwindle quickly. The abyssal vortexes within his meridian nodes spun quickly, gathering more Kai toward itself. But the silver-thirsting ore was insatiable, devouring more than Ryu could output. The thrumming of his spear weakened considerably. Soon, the aching in his arms began more pronounced, even as his bones began to take the brunt of the pressure. If it wasn't for the fact Ryu had learned to disperse the impact using his northern heavenly wind, his bones would have fractured by now. It's time to end this. The Valkyrie's eyes sharpened. The throne of the awoken moon sect cannot be claimed by a person like you. White serpents dance, lurking shadow. In that moment, it felt as though the Valkyrie had disappeared. It was like a looming pair of scarlet-red eyes trained on Ryu, treating him like prey to be prowled. All that remained was the tip of a pure white spear, condensed with such a high concentration of energy that the air itself trembled. Ryu was spent. His Kai had his rock bottom. He found it difficult to communicate with his heavenly wind, with his focus Kai so drained, and the weakness of his mental realm had made his dual wielding become sloppy once more. But this was exactly what he wanted. With everything else in his body flushed out, all that remained was a familiar pulsing within his pupils. So this is what you wanted to show me. The world before Ryu had completely changed. Instead of a Valkyrie and a spear, he saw bundles of black, gray, and white strings. It almost felt as though he could reach forward and tug them at will. Ryu felt a voice singing deep within his mind. No, it was an instinct, telling him exactly what these lines were. Lines of fate, karmic strings. If it's like this, you're not matched for me. White serpents dance, lurking shadow, life. It was a short four-letter word, but it encompassed a level of depth and mystery that could hardly be fathomed. There wasn't an individual in existence that could, with any sort of certainty, claim to comprehend it in its entirety. However, if one wanted to start peeling back its layers of complexity, how would you begin? Would you start with a list of species? Maybe you would start by defining what it was you considered life to be. Was it a word that referred to those that lived and breathed? Or was it more enigmatic, taking all of existence under its wing? If the few wielders of the first-ranked heavenly pupils were to be asked such a question, they'd answer very simply. To them there was no confusion at all. Life. It was a complex realm of cause and effect. Nothing more, nothing less. Everything related to life could be explained in this fashion. The future could be predicted by the past. The past could be deduced from the present. The present was decided by the past and the potential future. Any and everything could be described in this fashion. When you look at it this way, are there really any mysteries remaining? During the era of the Zhou ancestors, Ryu's pupils were an afterthought. They worked well to deduce the details of things, but compared to the fanciful abilities of the other heavenly pupils, they seemed lacking. At the time, the fourth-ranked heavenly pupils, which had fallen to the seventh rank during Ryu's first life, could quite literally turn people into puppets with a gaze. With such competition, it was no wonder the mysteries of heaven and earth pupils were neglected. No one knew exactly when these matters began to change, however. Those of the martial world began to notice that those born with these pupils seemed to have the world in their palms. It was too difficult to explain what they saw, so Ryu's senior brothers and sisters could only convey the strength of their eyes through their actions and their feats. Ryu could finally see the world his predecessors saw, a world of cause and effect, where every action had a set probability of causing another action. If he pulled here, something would be pushed there. If he struck here, the result would be a wound there. However, that was an incredibly simple way to look at it. What Ryu saw was far beyond that. He could see the lines of fate that constructed the Valkyrie's attack. He could see the line of logic, the deduction, and the comprehension that went into building it. He could see the objective of the technique's creator and the paths where the Valkyrie deviated from that objective. Even further, he saw lines of black that resulted in the bad. He saw lines of gray that were irrelevant to the current timeline of events. And he saw lines of white that guaranteed his victory. Like this, a beautiful Valkyrie with a gorgeous figure became nothing more than a calculation in Ryu's mind. Her body, one that made men swoon, became a woven doll of shaded string. Ryu's body shifted, it too disappearing along with the Valkyries. All that remained were his twin spears, circulating in perfect balance, two white serpents dancing in the shadows. The Valkyrie didn't have the time to be stunned. It felt as though her entire being was laid bare, as though she was stripped naked for the world to see. Seeing Ryu strike, she understood her mistake. The piercing technique was known as lurking shadow, so why was her spear so bright? Why couldn't hers be like Ryu's, disappearing under the light of her spear? The Valkyrie's head was blasted off of her shoulders. The attack wreaked such devastation that the foundation of the ice castle quaked. The elders fell into silence. How could a mere Kai refinement expert shake the foundation of a castle built by a ninth-order sect? The glow in Ryu's eyes dimmed as his spears slammed into the ground, holding him up from falling over. His neutral Kai was spent, and in that instant so was his cool Kai. No, his karmic Kai, the only Kai, capable of bringing out the true strength of his heavenly pupils. Unfortunately, the trial of thrones was only just beginning. Only now would the true experts of this once mighty sect begin to appear, the lofty Ninth Order ancestors. However, Ryu didn't seem worried. In fact, a fierce battle intent shone in his eyes. The glare was so fierce that even the elders and disciples watching from a separate realm felt their hearts boil. Not long later, the next Valkyrie shimmered into existence. It seemed to take longer and longer now, but seeing how much emotion his recent opponents had displayed, Ryu understood why. It obviously took longer and more energy to produce more accurate and lifelike projections. The Valkyrie's eyes widened with surprise when she saw Ryu, but the abrupt show of emotion disappeared as soon as it appeared. Young Master Tatsuya. But the line of Kai entered Ryu's ears. It was obvious what the Valkyrie wanted to say. Ryu, he should be dead. How was he here? And why was the scion of the Tatsuya clan taking their small awoken moon sex throne trial? Even if he stripped them bare of everything they had, it wouldn't equate to even a single % of the resources the Tatsuya clan could pour into him. It didn't surprise Ryu that this Valkyrie recognized him as the last Ninth Order ancestor. She had been the final ancestor before the collapse of the sect, and had thus been around during Ryu's life. However, she was also smart. She was aware of the collapse of the Tatsuya clan, so she wouldn't foolishly call out Ryu's name in such a way. It was impossible to know who was listening and paying attention to them at this moment. Still, even though he expected this, Ryu's heart began to race. Could he finally find out what happened after he took his own life? He wanted to know. No, he needed to know. Young Master Tatsuya, although I'd like to allow you this victory, the rules of the trial bind me from doing so. My hand is being forced. Please forgive my rudeness. I need to know what happened. Ryu finally spoke, making his intentions clear. Replying to young master, I can answer your questions, but you must last long enough to hear them. Ryu smiled lightly. His spears disappeared, replaced by a single halberd a head and a half taller than even himself, who stood at over 2 meters tall. If it was just about lasting, he was very confident. The Valkyrie trembled when she saw Ryu's change of weapon. Everyone of that era knew about the 3 Tatsuya saintly weapons: the spear, the glaive, and the halberd. The first was known as the God Emperor, a master spearman who had unrivaled cleverness. The second was known as the War God, a man who knew nothing but war and battle. But the third, this was a weapon that stood above both others: the Dragon God. Ryu never used his halberd. It wasn't because he preferred the spear or the glaive. It was rather because every trial he had faced until now was simply a way of testing himself. He wanted to push himself to his limits because this stage was far too small for him. Simply put, if he used his halberd, there would be no suspense. Tatsuya clansmen were the descendants of the fire dragon, a mighty mystical beast that once stood at the very top of this realm. While the spear and the glaive tapped into the human aspects of their Tatsuya clan, the halberd tapped into their bestial aura. It was the true strength of their clan. Simply holding the halberd in his hand, Ryu felt his fire dragon blood bubble to life, causing a heated steam to emit from his body. Although he could only tap into 5% of that feeling with just a single hand, it filled him with such power that he felt as though he could topple a mountain range. Come, as you wish, young master. In a flash she stepped forward, Monalize. During Ryu's first life, she had only just taken over the position of ancestor. Her heart held a heavy burden. She felt that she let the founders of her sect down. However, this trial ironically gave her hope. She could hold her head high and say that she helped the scion of the Tatsuya clan grow. Ryu raised his arm. It was once tired and spent, but a surging hot Kai erupted from his blood. It wasn't the Kai of the Kai realm, but rather the vital Kai of his fire dragon blood. Boom! Ryu was sent flying backward. No matter how oppressive his halberd, he was still using it with just one arm. He didn't want to end this battle so soon. He needed to hear Mona Lisa's story. At the same time, he wanted to rely on the enraged state of his blood while Ailsa helped him to replenish his neutral Kai. Young master, Mona Lisa continued to attack. The trial rules that bound her didn't allow her to use anything less than the full strength she wielded at Ryu's age, so she could only continue to oppress him. I do not know the full details of what occurred. The inner workings of the shrine plane are too grand for my small stature, but I will tell you what I know. After young master's death, there was much speculation. The Tatsuya clan remained silent about the true cause. However, many undercurrents began to surge afterward. Ryu nodded to himself emotionlessly, revealing that the scion of the Tatsuya clan died by suicide would be an irredeemable stain, one that would no doubt harm the faith of the clan. While he was certain that his parents wouldn't care about such a thing, the various shrine elders would. In addition, his parents would have went along with it, not wanting their son's memory to be stained. Though I do not know how young Master died, I do know that Master Titus was enraged. His anger boiled the skies himself, and he claimed that he would drag your soul back from that realm. Ryu's eyes constricted into tiny pinholes. The fluctuations in his emotions were so fierce that he lost his grip on his vital kai. His strength erupted so abruptly that his right arm split into a shower of blood, bulging in size by one-fold. As his strength turned tyrannical, even Mona Lisa was forced to take a step back after his strike despite him still using just one arm. Ryu grit his teeth. Continue. That realm, it was a place even lofty individuals of the highest plane didn't dare to name. But Ryu wasn't such a superstitious person. The mere idea of something didn't shake him with fear, but the idea of his father entering that place. Ryu didn't need to guess how his father found a path to that realm. It was his own fault. Why did he have to find the location of the death shrine? Why couldn't he have kept it to himself instead of blabbering away? If he had, his father, even if he wanted to enter that place, would have never been able to. Our enemies took advantage of the master's disappearance. Such a small event shouldn't have shaken the faith of the Tatsuya clan, but for reasons unknown, it was as though the heavens themselves were against us. That one event turned the tide so fiercely that we couldn't fight back. Ryu's teeth clenched. He was completely oblivious to shocked gazes of the elders who still watched. How could they not be shocked? Just minutes ago, he had used their clan's core teaching strike better than their ancestor could, and now he was lasting against their ninth-order ancestor with just one bloody arm. But Ryu didn't care. His mind was elsewhere. He thought back to a conversation he had with Alina during his last day. She had said that numerous holy winged saintesses appeared. In fact, she had said that 9 appeared. Back then, Ryu had been shocked. A single talent of that caliber was already amazing, but 9 appearing in a single generation was bordering on ridiculous. Simply put, the Holy Wing clan didn't have enough faith to sustain such great talent being birthed so frequently. Though he didn't say much, that seed of doubt continued to grow. His pupils throbbed as though they could feel the tide of fate shifting. Unnaturally, the Holy Wing clan, Mona Lisa's eyes widened. How did you know? She had wanted to be delicate about the topic, especially considering she knew the young master's fiancée was a member of the clan. But to think he knew himself, not just the Holy Wing clan, but it felt as though the whole shrine plane turned against the Tatsuya clan. The only individuals who remained by their side were the 2 Phoenix clans and the Cunning clan. Even the Tatsuya clan's subordinates like the Scarlet Sparrow clan defected to the enemy. It was then that the shrine war began. The tide of faith suddenly turned as though young master's death was the focal point of everything.